Chapter 7:11. There were no excessive greetings, sorrow, or anger. The members of the Qinian unit who remained in the quiet courtyard calmly greeted Fan Xian. Then, in the shortest amount of time possible, they reported the internal situation of the Overwatch Council they knew. During these 7 days, a large portion of the Bureau of Military Affairs stationed outside the Overwatch Council had been withdrawn. Under the strong pressure of the Palace Edict and Yan Bingyun's cooperation, the cleansing and changing of blood within the Overwatch Council was carried out quickly and effectively. This information was sensitive and important. However, the members of the Qinian unit in this courtyard were all capable officials in the Overwatch Council. During these 7 days, they had purposely asked around on behalf of Fan Xian, who was under house arrest in the manor. They had managed to obtain a great deal of information. Fan Xian listened silently and nodded slightly. After Chen Pingping died and his position as director was removed, the emperor's change of blood and filling of water in the Overwatch Council was all within expectations. With Yan Bingyun's help, in addition to the emperor's might, the Overwatch Council was like a group of dragons without a head. No one could forcefully reverse this trend. Although Yan Bingyun doesn't know about this council, he has often been at your side these years. We are somewhat worried. A member of the Qinian unit looked at Fan Xian and said. We need to choose a new meeting point in Jingdo. This official directly called Yan Bingyun by his name. It was clear he no longer had any respect. Although Yan Bingyun had never joined the Qinian unit, as Fan Xian's right-hand man and a high-ranking official of the Overwatch Council, he had always been respected by the Qinian unit. However, the things Yan Bingyun had done in the Overwatch Council these days made all of the Overwatch Council officials feel hatred toward him. Yan Bingyun was Fan Xian's trusted aide, but he was never someone Fan Xian could completely trust. This Sir Yan Jr., who was skilled in strategy, was an independent person. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then shook his head. He didn't express an opinion on this or say they should continue to choose another meeting place. He still had some hope in Yan Bingyun. He was even faintly worried that Yan Bingyun would die in the anger of the Overwatch Council. After today's meeting, the people of the Qinian unit would have to leave Jingdo. This little courtyard that Wang Qinian had spent 120 liang of silver to buy would be abandoned. There was no need to waste any more effort. Seeing Fan Xian did not reply, the official shook his head and continued his report. Once the city gates open, the people heading towards Shiliang and North Min have already left. Presumably, Sir Deng and Sir Su will receive the news at the first instant. Do not worry. This was what Fan Xian was most worried about when he was under house arrest. Deng Ziyu and Su Wanmao were his two most trusted subordinates after Wang Qinian, so he had given them the most important duties. One was in northern Qi and then Shiliang. The other was in Jiangnan to keep an eye on the palace treasury. If these two people were eliminated by the emperor, Fan Xian would probably regret it for the rest of his life. Although he didn't know if the emperor would have the leisure to set up an assassination beforehand, since the news had been sent out, Fan Xian felt slightly more at ease. He glanced at the members of the Qinian unit beside him in the courtyard. The corners of his lips twitched into a warm smile. He had been under house arrest in the manor for 7 days. His subordinates had also been busy for 7 days. Other than investigating information, they had finally thought of all the ways to enter the Fan Manor. It had to be said that these subordinates were the most effective group of people in the Overwatch Council. The name of the Qinian unit was taken from Wang Qinian. From the 4th year of the Qing calendar until Wang Qinian disappeared in the autumn of the 7th year of the Qing calendar, all of the members were chosen by Wang Qinian. These members were originally unremarkable civil servants outside of the Overwatch Council or lower-level officials who were not valued. However, they just happened to be in line with Fan Xian's liking and Wang Qinian's temper. Once these officials were gathered under Fan Xian's command, they suddenly recovered their initial powerful execution abilities and regained their luster. They became a secretive yet famous group within the Overwatch Council, a group that directly belonged to Fan Xian. For example, these days, the members of the Qinian unit's responses were very much in line with Fan Xian's style. Once they knew things were not going well, they would immediately retreat into the darkness. Under the precondition of protecting their own lives, they did not impulsively do anything. Instead, they carefully investigated the reactions and intelligence of all sides. They then found suitable methods to hand to Fan Xian to decide. It had to be said that it was a kind of good fortune for Fan Xian to have such loyal but not arrogant, capable but not blind subordinates. His gaze swept across the faces of the people in the council. His heart jumped. He suddenly thought that other than Wang Qinyan's discerning eyes, how could there be so many elites within the Overwatch Council that had been buried for so many years and covered in dust for so many years, waiting for him to come from Dongzhou to Jingdou before they were discovered? Did Wang Qinyan really have such a sharp eye? Or was it that these loyal subordinates had always been suppressed by the old ancestor of the Overwatch Council and left for him to use now? Fan Xian's brows furrowed, and his heart became a mess. Thinking of Chen Pingping's kindness to him, he was speechless for a long time. He sighed, but he didn't have time to ask these subordinates anything. He waved his hand and walked into the quiet room beside the well at the back of the council. There was a large desk in the room. On it were paper envelopes used by the Overwatch Council, as well as a set of tools for making secret words. The inkstone was placed to the right of the desk. The weather in early autumn was not very cold, so it was easy to melt the ink. However, Fan Xian did not grind the ink. Instead, he took out a pencil made by the palace treasury from under the desk and twirled it between 2 fingers. The tip of the pencil did not land on the snow-white paper. After thinking of many ways, he had escaped the eyes of the court and come to this little courtyard. Without question, Fan Xian had already thought clearly about what orders he should give. However, he still put the pencil down. Once anything landed on paper, it was a weakness and the possibility of it being leaked. In the winter of the 6th year of the Qing calendar, he often came to this little courtyard. At that time, Sea Lily's brother was still being held hostage by him. At that time, Haitang was still in the little courtyard in the north urging Xia to pull the mill. At that time, Fan Xian often wrote letters to Haitang. Thinking about it carefully, although he was fighting fiercely with the eldest princess and the second prince in the capital, his state of mind was actually calm and happy. Now that Haitang Duo had become an enemy of the Qing kingdom on the grasslands and Xia had been forced to disappear in Shangjing, Fan Xian's state of mind had long changed. All of the members of the Qinian unit stood in the room, silently waiting for Fan Xian to give his orders. In a moment, leave Jingdou immediately. Before you receive my written orders, you are not allowed to return. Fan Xian didn't spend much time sorting out his emotions. Staring at everyone, he said in a heavy tone, "This is the first order. You must survive." "Yes," everyone replied in a low voice. Then, under the indication of Fan Xian's gaze, they left, leaving only 2 people. The Qinian unit had been under Wang Qinyan's control for the first 3 years. Later, it was handed over to Deng Ziyu. After Deng Ziyu went to northern Qi, Fan Xian personally managed it. Mu Feng was only responsible for personal matters. There were not many people in the unit. Many had died in the turmoil these years. Presently, some of them were with Deng Ziyu in Shiliang, some were with Su Wenmao in Jiangnan and North Min, and a large portion had been left behind by Fan Xian in Dongyi. The ones still in Jingdou were the only subordinates Fan Xian could directly use. Because of this, Fan Xian didn't want them to lose any more people. Fan Xian stared at one of the 2 people in the room and took out a jade hook from his clothes. Handing it over, he said, "Go to Qingzhou. Don't alert the people of the 4th Bureau. Follow Xia Mingji's merchant group directly into the grasslands and find Hu Gu. Tell him that I need him to launch a feint attack at the end of autumn and trap the Qingzhou and Dingzhou armies in Shiliang Road." The official accepted the jade hook and straightforwardly said, "The left virtuous prince has been dead for almost a year. Although Hu Gu has your secret support and has gathered a lot of power, I'm afraid he doesn't have the power to persuade the Hu people to brave the dangerous weather of late autumn and early winter to attack the Qing kingdom." Everyone knew that it was not easy for Fan Xian to come out, so these subordinates did not hide their opinions. Instead, they did their best to express their intentions as quickly and completely as possible. It is just a feint attack. Besides, he wants revenge. If he can exhaust the strength of the court and the right virtuous prince, he will certainly be willing, Fan Xian said. As for the problem of not having enough power, tell him that I will arrange for the people of the court to stand on his side. But presumably, the news from Jingdou will also reach the grasslands. Once Hu Gu knows that you have lost power, will he tear up the original agreement in Dingzhou? The official who accepted the jade hook still fully expressed his opinion. Fan Xian did not show a trace of impatience and said, "Hu Gu is a smart person. He will have to place his bet on me." He glanced at the jade hook in the official's hand and shook his head. If he wants the owner of the jade hook to live, The jade hook was a childhood accessory of the last princess of the Hu tribe on the grasslands, Ma Suasua. When Fan Xian had met Hu Gu in Dingzhou, she had given it to him. The token this time was the second one. Although Ma Suasua had been placed in the great prince's manor, her identity still belonged to Baoyue brothel. No matter how much power Fan Xian had lost, it would not be difficult for him to deal with this weak woman. The official thought for a moment and felt that the director's orders had not missed anything. He put the jade hook into his clothes, left the study, and left the little courtyard. As for how this member of the Qinian unit would escape Jingdou, cross Qingzhou, enter the grasslands, and make contact with Hu Gu, that was his problem. Fan Xian trusted in the abilities of these subordinates. Go to Dingzhou, enter the general's manor, and find the heir, Hong Cheng. Fan Xian's clothes were like a treasure chest. He took out another piece of paper. The writing on the paper was faintly a poem. This is a token. Jingdou is in turmoil, and I have been chased out of the Overwatch Council. He must have received the news early. He probably won't believe the token of the Overwatch Council and the token of the Qinian unit. Show him this piece of paper, and he will know you are one of my people. This piece of paper was torn from a book. The book was a collection of poems from the previous dynasty. This was a gift the second prince had given to Fan Xian through Hongqing many years ago when Fan Xian was spending the winter in the Tsang Mountains. Many people had probably long forgotten, but Fan Xian knew Hongqing would not. Tell Hongqing everything I said earlier about Hu Gu and the news that the Hu people will invade at the beginning of winter. Have him prepare and try to fight as hard as possible. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. Yes, he should be able to understand my intentions now. I just want to find a way for him not to be summoned back to Jingdou. He should know what to do. I just want to remind him that the two sides need to cooperate well. I am giving him this seemingly hard-to-chew bone, but it is actually a delicious piece of fatty meat. Don't let the Hu people take advantage of it. Yes, sir. The official accepted the order and left. People came out and people came in. Fan Xian methodically used the members of the Qinian unit to convey his will to the powers under heaven that he cared about and could influence. Go to Dongyi and find Mu Feng'er first. Tell him my intentions. The rebellion in the Liang kingdom can be used a little. Keep that fire about the same size. Don't burn too fiercely and don't extinguish it too quickly. After this is done, go see 13th Wang and tell him I am waiting for him in Jingdou. Fan Xian sat behind the desk and furrowed his brows slightly. Inciting internal strife in Dongyi could drag the great royal brother there. However, it would be unfair to 13th Wang, so he could only hide it from him for now. Also, have him use the command sword of the sword hut on my behalf to pick out 2 trustworthy people and send them to Jiangnan by Su Wenmao's side. Personally deliver this letter to the great prince's hands. Tell him that everything is fine in Jingdou and that there is no need to rush back. There was some worry between Fan Xian's brows. He could explain his thoughts clearly to Li Hongqing, but he did not have the confidence to control the great prince. Once the news of Chen Pingping's wretched death reached Dongyi, the great prince's anger would probably not be any less than his. The great prince had called Chen Pingping uncle since he was young. Putting aside the close relationship between Lady Ning and Chen Pingping and the fact that Chen Pingping had protected the great prince in Lady Ning's womb, given the friendship between the great prince and Chen Garden these years, given the great prince's personality, it was possible that he would bring hundreds of soldiers to kill his way back to Jingdou. This was what Fan Xian feared the most. Before he launched his 1,000-li surprise attack back to the capital, the only order he had given was for Mu Feng'er and the others to return to Dongyi and tell the great prince not to return to the capital. How could Mu Feng'er alone stop the great prince's anger? Fan Xian had no choice but to personally write a letter. With sincere words, he begged his fiery big brother, who had inherited his mother's legacy, to barely control his urge to question the emperor and his desire to avenge Chen Pingping and stay obediently in Dongyi. Regardless of whether it was Li Hongqing, who led troops in Dingzhou, or the great prince, who controlled 10,000 elite troops in Dongyi, they were the only 2 military forces Fan Xian could count on in the Qing kingdom. However, these elite troops belonged to the Qing kingdom and the emperor. If these 2 young people of the royal family were summoned back to Jingdou, then Fan Xian would have no hope at all. Fan Xian absolutely believed that as long as Li Hongqing and the great prince returned to the capital, the man sitting on the throne would not give them any opportunity to lead soldiers in the next few years. This was precisely because of their relationship with Fan Xian and Chen Pingping. The order sent to Jiangnan to warn Su Wenmao had also been sent. Other than his identity as a member of the Qinian unit, Su Wenmao was also an official of the court's palace treasury transport company. Furthermore, the palace treasury was of utmost importance to Fan Xian, the Qing kingdom, and the emperor. No one would let go of it. Thus, Su Wenmao could not hide himself or leave Jiangnan and North Min. Thus, his situation was the most dangerous. Fan Xian could only hope that in these few years, Su Wenmao had already raised enough direct subordinates in the 3 workshops. He also hoped that Ran Bo, An's brother, would remember old friendships. From his side, other than having Dongyi's sword hut send aces into Jiangnan to protect Su Wenmao's life, there was nothing else he could do. The member of the Qinian unit heading to Jiangnan also shouldered an additional mission. He helped Fan Xian bring a message to Xueqi and had him choose a day to come to Jingdo during these 2 months. Having the current master of the Ming family come to Jingdo did not mean that Fan Xian had anything important to give to him. Rather, it was Fan Xian's test of him. After all, when Xueqi submitted to him, he submitted to the Qing court he represented and the terrifying Overwatch Council. Now that Fan Xian had lost his power and returned to nobility, and the Overwatch Council had been sealed into a pile of mud, who knew if other thoughts would rise to Xueqi's heart? The Ming family was important to Jiangnan and also important to the Cold War between Fan Xian and the emperor. If Xueqi thought things through and directly knelt before the throne, what would Fan Xian do? Thus, he had to see just how much loyalty Xueqi and the Jiangnan water bandits still had to him. If Xueqi had truly forgotten the hard days everyone had spent in Jiangnan, Fan Xian's head lowered slightly. He could only have the Ming family change masters and have Zhaoshang Money House take the lead. Orders were given out one by one. The members of the Qinian unit accepted their orders and left. They did not linger at all. Before long, the lonely and secluded little courtyard was empty. There was only Fan Xian behind the desk and the official in front of him. It appeared particularly quiet. The slightly damp autumn wind blew through the slightly dry air, and made the water bucket by the well in the courtyard roll around and make a few noises. Probably no one would have thought that in such an unremarkable courtyard, a young man who had already had all of his official positions taken away and all of his power stripped was giving out order after order with the intention of carrying out a final struggle against the Qing kingdom's powerful national machinery. "Why did you change your name to Hong Yiqing?" Fan Xian asked quietly as he looked at the last remaining official of the Qinian unit. He used his finger to gently stroke the little knife he had just taken out from his clothes. This subordinate was the one who had discovered in Qingzhou that the Northern Qi Emperor had intended to use the North Sea Blade Workshop to provoke a relationship between Fan Xian and the Qing Emperor. This person had performed a great service in Qingzhou, and was also one of the first people Wang Qinian had placed in the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian saw that this person was thinking of Lao Wang and had moved him to his side. He had followed him all the way to Dongyi. The last time Fan Xian had returned to the capital to debrief, he had left him in Jingdo to act as liaison. It was because of this that this person now had the opportunity to face Fan Xian one last time and not worry helplessly in Dongyi. "I heard that in the past, there was a person called Hong Chongqing. He was valiant and righteous and deeply appreciated by you. In the end, he died in the battle to quell a rebellion in Danzhou. You often think about him. I am not talented, but since I have received your great kindness, I want to repay your kindness with my death." "Don't die." Fan Xian sighed. He also thought of Qing Hua, who had died under Yan Xiaoyi's arrow. Qing Hua had survived the hellish situation of the navy massacring the island and the water birds eating people. In the end, he had not lived more than 2 years with him. He handed the knife to Hong Yiqing, stared into his eyes, and said word by word, "In the end, I kept you here because I have something important to tell you. You have to listen clearly. Don't miss a single word." "Yes, sir." Hong Yiqing felt a glimmer of nervousness. "I've already sent 2 people to Shiliang Road, but Deng Ziyu is still out in the open. The imperial court will definitely take him in. Even if he can escape, I need someone to continue the task of the people I've arranged there. You've stayed in Qingzhou for a long time and are familiar with Shiliang Road. I'll leave this to you." Hong Yiqing was slightly startled. His throat was a little dry, and his face was slightly hot. He had not thought that the director would give him such an important task as the manager of Shiliang Road. "Most importantly, you also have to enter the grasslands, find the king's tent, and find a woman called Songji Xianling." Fan Xian's eyes narrowed. Looking at him, he said each word clearly. "Tell her not to worry about Ku He or Do Do. Worry about me first. Have her cooperate with Hugo and convince the chief. Hong Yiqing didn't know that Fan Xian had already arranged certain matters on the grasslands. He didn't understand, but he calmly agreed. I chose you because Songji Xianling has seen you before, Fan Xian said calmly with his head lowered. Give this little knife to her. Then, have her leave the grasslands and come to Jingdo to see me. What if she doesn't leave? Hong Yiqing unconsciously asked. Fan Xian raised his head. After a moment of silence he said, just say that I am going to die. It's up to her whether she wants to come or not. These words were said very helplessly and shamelessly. Hong Yiqing looked at Fan Xian in a daze. He couldn't understand why the seemingly omnipotent director would say such emotional words. He also couldn't understand what kind of person Songji Xianling was for him to think so highly of her. The moment he accepted the knife, Fan Xian's fingers suddenly froze. He stood up from behind the desk. Hong Yiqing only noticed the strangeness a moment later. His face was slightly pale. He pulled out the poisoned dagger from his boots and quietly walked behind the door of the room. There was a strange movement outside the door. In this secluded little courtyard that no outsider knew about, someone had suddenly come. I'm back. My mind is clear. My mood is very good, very high, very powerful. Chapter 7:12. Soft footsteps rang out in the courtyard outside the door. The sound was very weak, particularly as the market at the end of the alley was still bustling and would be bustling until dusk. Thus, these weak footsteps were almost drowned out by the faint sounds of bargaining. However, these weak footsteps fell into Fan Xian's ears with unusual clarity. He narrowed his eyes and focused on the movements outside. The middle and ring fingers of his hand unconsciously moved a few times. Only then did he realize that his black dagger had long fallen into the autumn rain in front of the royal palace. He didn't know where it had gone, but he remained calm. He still had full confidence that he could subdue the person outside in one blow. Hong Yiqing gripped his dagger tightly as he carefully and silently squatted behind the door. He held his breath as he watched the approaching figure. The figure strangely walked straight to the door and gently knocked twice. Hearing the rhythmic knocking, Hong Yiqing's expression clearly relaxed. This was because this was the code used by the Qinian team to identify one's identity. Fan Xian did not relax. He was not completely sure whether or not the Qinian unit had been infiltrated by the court, or if they had already made contact with the periphery. After all, from the Dazhou incident and Gao Da's existence, the emperor's attention to intelligence far exceeded Fan Xian's or Chen Pingping's expectations. Furthermore, the internal court must have hidden many loyal people within the Overwatch Council. Otherwise, Yan Bingyun would not have been able to control that sinister courtyard within 7 days. It's me, the figure outside the door said in a raspy voice. It seemed to know that there was someone in the room. Hearing this voice, Hong Yiqing did not recognize who it was. Fan Xian's expression immediately changed. There was joy, sadness, and surprise. The door was pushed open. A middle-aged man with an unfamiliar face and wearing the clothing of a vegetable farmer commonly seen in the outskirts of Jingdo walked in. Leader Wang. Hong Yiqing lowered his voice and looked in disbelief at the newcomer. From the familiar warm smile in his eyes, he recognized the other person's identity. After all, he had been personally chosen by Wang Qinian to join the unit. He was familiar with Wang Qinian. However, in the hearts of most Overwatch Council officials, Wang Qinian had died 3 years ago because of the Dong Mountain Rebellion. How could he appear alive and well in front of them today? Wang Qinian, in disguise, patted Hong Yiqing on the shoulder. Then, he focused and calmed himself. Very seriously, he suppressed his excitement and bowed deeply to Fan Xian, who was standing behind the table. Let's talk another day. There will be a time when we meet again. Let's go do business. Fan Xian smiled and tossed the knife in his hand to Hong Yiqing. At this moment, Hong Yiqing still had an unsettled expression on his face, but he knew that the matter was urgent and did not dare to delay any longer. He bowed to the two of them and headed towards the grassland in the west to find the person called Songji Xianling. Fan Xian walked out from behind the table and stood in front of Wang Qinian. He looked at him quietly for a moment and then hugged him. He patted his back forcefully and then straightened his body. He could easily see the exhaustion that Wang Qinian could not hide even after his disguise. Fan Xian gazed at Wang Qinian. Wang Qinian also gazed at him. The two of them didn't speak for a long time. After a long time, Fan Xian sighed and said, "It's truly been a long time." On the road back to the capital from Dongyi, Wang Qinian had desperately blocked the Overwatch Council's carriages and informed Fan Xian of the shocking news. At that time, the two of them had no time to say or sigh. Fan Xian had risen and rushed straight to Jingdo to save Chen Pingping. Calculating carefully, it had been exactly 8 days since Fan Xian returned to the capital before Wang Qinian once again rushed back to Jingdo. Before that, Wang Qinian had already made a difficult, flying journey from Dazhou to the northeast. 2 long journeys had truly exhausted Wang Qinian, who was no longer young. Even though he was one of the wings of the Overwatch Council, he was almost at his limit. Fan Xian helped him to a chair and sat down. After a moment of silence he said, "Where have you been these years?" Fan Xian knew that he hadn't died. He also knew that under Chen Pingping's arrangements, Wang Qinian and his family, who had escaped Dong Mountain, had all concealed their identities. For the safety of the Wang family, Fan Xian had only investigated briefly before giving up on the job. During these 3 years, Fan Xian often thought of him. He thought of his closest subordinate, the cute old Wang who knew the most of his secrets. "I've actually never left the capital. I've always been by the director's side, always watching over you. It's enough that I know you're doing well." Wang Qinian spoke in a raspy voice. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, "I came back late." He was talking about the matter of Chen Pingping. Wang Qinian lowered his head and was also silent for a long time. In a low voice he said, "It was I who reported too late." In reality, the two of them had already done their best. However, they were still unable to change what had already happened. A faint sense of sorrow and self-blame filled the room. "How is the family?" "Yes, the court shouldn't be able to find out." "That's good. Come back to my side." "Okay." After this extremely natural reply, Fan Xian's heart, which had been cold for a long time, warmed a rare sliver. In a quiet voice he asked, "I had you follow the group to Dongyi. Why did you come back?" "The 4,500 Black Knights have entered Dongyi territory. One of them should be heading toward 10 Family Village right now. The matter the director gave me has been completed, so I rushed back. I was only delayed for 2 days, so it has slowed down a bit," Wang Qinian said. Jinggu, the old man from the 7th Bureau, and Zhong Zhuai are all on that road. The most powerful force the director left behind is gathering in 10 Family Village. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then smiled with a complicated expression. Who would have thought that the matter of 10 Family Village would not be able to hide from him? If the director wants to know something, he will eventually know, Wang Qinian said. "Let's not talk about this anymore." Fan Xian sighed. "With you at my side, many things are much easier to do. At least, like today, I wouldn't have to waste 7 days to get out of that net." After exchanging a few words, Wang Qinian clearly understood what had happened in Jingdo recently. He couldn't help but faintly sigh. If the Overwatch Council was still in my hands, it would be much easier to do things. Other than the Qinian unit, the only people Fan Xian could truly trust and use were his trusted subordinates all over the world. However, the headquarters of the Overwatch Council was gradually beginning to fall apart, particularly with Yan Bingyun and his son controlling the 4th Bureau for generations. If this went on, Fan Xian and his group of old officials' influence in the council would probably grow weaker and weaker. After all, this world is still the Emperor's. Even if at the beginning, the officials of the council felt heartache for the director's misfortune, as time went on, they had to accept this reality. Loyalty to the Emperor and patriotism. The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched slightly. He would only show his disdain for royal power in front of a small number of people. How many people would dare to directly oppose that chair? "Sir Yan is not that kind of person," Wang Qinian said in a raspy voice. Wang Qinian said in a hoarse voice. The Lord Yan in this sentence was naturally Yan Ruahai. "I don't understand what Yan Bingyun is thinking." "The director has instructions for him," Fan Xian said with his eyes slightly closed. Fan Xian closed his eyes slightly and said, "The director does not want the world to bleed because of him. Furthermore, he is doing everything he can to ensure the continuation of the power in my hands and severing me from him. If I perform as well as he thinks, in a few years, I will rise again. At that time, perhaps the emperor will also be old." Yes, this was Chen Pingping's wish. The outward appearance of this wish was in line with Yan Bingyun's attitude of putting the world first. Thus, Yan Bingyun steadily and stubbornly followed Chen Pingping's plans. What followed would depend on Fan Xian's attitude. Yan Bingyun will not watch as the Overwatch Council becomes my revenge machine. Public tools cannot be used. This is probably a very advanced concept, Fan Xian said calmly. However, he has forgotten that the world is the Emperor's. All of the officials' martial power is the Emperor's private tool. He said with slight mockery, "Unfortunately, our Sir Yen Jr. does not understand this. It is not so easy to be a loyal official and an unfilial son. I hope he can sit more stably in the Overwatch Council in the future." Wang Qinian heard that Fan Xian did not have much resentment toward Yan Bingyun. He narrowed his eyes and said, "What do we do next?" "You rest first. 10,000 years is too long, but you can't just seize the moment." Fan Xian stood by Wang Qinian's side and gently pressed on his slightly slumped shoulders. In an even voice he said, "You must be tired these days. Choose a place to stay in the capital. I don't think many people will be able to find you. Then, I have something for you to do." Given Wang Qinian's tracking and hiding abilities, even if the court continued to cast a large net outside the Fan Manor, it probably wouldn't be able to stop him and Fan Xian from meeting. With him, although Fan Xian's body was left in Jingdo, his voice could finally travel out. It would no longer be as difficult as it had been these 7 days. Wang Qinian already knew of the information Fan Xian had sent out through the Qinian unit to various places under heaven. He did not make any suggestions for this plan. He was just not sure if Fan Xian wanted to reveal his cards here, or if he was just passively carrying out a defense, hiding his power outside Jingdo and waiting for a suitable opportunity to explode out. "I hope Ziyue can come out of Shiliang alive." Fan Xian's brows were slightly melancholic. "I had originally planned on having him return to Northern Qi to do this. However, I have always been worried. After all, even if they are willing to follow me, it is because I am a Qing person. Perhaps in their eyes, I am a member of the royal family. Thus, even when facing the Emperor, they can be confident and confident. However, if it is Northern Qi..." He raised his head and looked at Wang Qinian. "If I wanted to take you with me to commit treason, would you come with me?" Wang Qinian smiled bitterly and stood up. "Haven't I done a lot of these things in the past few years? Even if you want to take me into the dirt, I can only go." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Thus, I will only be at ease if you do this." The two of them left the small courtyard one after the other. It was destined that no one would come to this courtyard for a very long time after spending 120 taels of silver on it. Only the lonely raindrops and the lonely cobwebs would accompany the smooth paper and the cold ink. A large hat covered Fan Xian's head. Following the muddy road in the market, he followed Wang Qinian's figure from a distance. He only relaxed when he finally lost him. For one, it was to confirm that there were no ambushes outside the little courtyard. For another, it was to calm his heart. If even he and Wang Qinian had lost him, who in Jingdo could follow him? After finishing all of this, Fan Xian's mood relaxed a little. It was like the sky that had finally stopped the autumn rain 3 days ago. Although it had not cleared up and there were still faint black clouds, they could still drift with the wind and let some clear light into the world. They would not be blindly heavy and cold. In the end, the affairs of the world had to be settled. Before the Emperor acted, Fan Xian had to do his best to preserve the power in his hands. Only then would he have enough power and weapons when he laid his cards on the table in the future. For some reason, he always felt that he had made a mistake somewhere. The faint wariness was like a cloud that kept turning over and over in his mind, but he could never see its shape clearly. Leaving the market behind him and the bustling ordinary and harsh sounds of the marketplace behind him, Fan Xian followed the Jingdo city gates and the radial street that led toward the royal palace toward the south of the city. The matter had already been completed. The people of the Qinian unit had collectively left Jingdo. He didn't need to worry about anything. Even being under house arrest in the manor was not an unbearable pain. However, he had to pass the royal palace on the way. Passing the royal palace in the distance, Fan Xian couldn't stop the pain. He forced himself not to think about the scenes from a few days ago. He couldn't help but begin to think about how his sister was doing in the palace. Although Eunuch Dai had said that the emperor treated Ruoruo like a child, Ruoruo's present identity was, after all, a hostage. She knew that her days in the palace would be difficult. This was the emperor's light brushstroke, but it directly tore apart the picture scroll that Fan Xian had worked so hard to paint. It was impossible for Fan Xian to leave Jingdo. It was all because of this. It was raining. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and let his clothes and hat cover the fine raindrops. Silently, he left under the gaze of the royal palace. This place was strictly guarded. There were not many people on the streets, but he could hear a few curses about the weather. Presumably, the continuous autumn rain had only stopped for 2 days and had fallen again. This made the people of Jingdo very dissatisfied. There were times when dissatisfaction turned into numbness from habit. The rain was not heavy. Fan Xian walked silently toward the manor like a prisoner forced into prison. There was truly nothing he could do. As he walked, he thought. He compared the person in the royal palace to himself in all aspects. In the end, he placed his thoughts on the hemp-clothed ascetic monks. From the moment Chen Pingping returned to the capital to his imprisonment to Fan Xian's charge into the execution field, the hemp-clothed ascetic monks had suddenly appeared in the royal palace, the Overwatch Council, and the execution field. Although these ascetic monks were powerful, it was not enough to make Fan Xian's heart tremble. However, he did not understand. Furthermore, because of these ascetic monks, he thought of the illusory temple that Fan Xian knew existed. The Qing kingdom had always maintained a respectful distance from the path of the gods. It was not like northern Qi, where Tianyi Dao permeated the officialdom and people. Particularly after the appearance of the powerful emperor, the status of the Qing temple in the Qing kingdom's life took a sudden turn for the worse. It completely became an accessory and decoration. The small number of Qing temple ascetic monks scattered throughout the world became an object forgotten by people. Why had these forgotten people appeared in Jingdo, by the emperor's side? Did the emperor already have complete control of the Qing temple? However, the great priest of the Qing temple had died strangely. The second priest, Great Master San Shi, had died hopelessly. More than half of the priests of the Qing temple on Dong Mountain had died to the emperor's anger. Why had these ascetic monks of the Qing temple completely fallen to the emperor's side? Was it truly as Chen Pingping had said? He had faintly guessed that the emperor back then had truly come into contact with the will of the temple? Was it because of this that these ascetic monks did not hold a grudge of many years and stood by the emperor's side to help him shine in this world? The rain did not grow heavier. There were opportunities in heaven and earth. When Fan Xian shook off his thoughts from the fine rain and unconsciously raised his head, he saw the Qing temple not far in front of him. It was the Qing temple, completely black with hidden green eaves, by the desolate and quiet side of the street, receiving the rain from the heavens and not stirring up a speck of dust. It had long walls on the outside and a round tower inside. Fan Xian stared in a daze at this delicate and pretty building. He didn't know what to feel. In this temple, he had once brushed shoulders with the emperor. He had once seen a girl who loved to nibble on chicken legs under the curtains. He had also carefully studied the strange murals painted under the eaves. However, he had never understood any of the things he truly wanted to understand. He should have returned to his manor. At this moment, he unconsciously walked up the steps. Passing through the rarely closed temple door, he walked directly into the temple. Under the accompaniment of the fine autumn rain, he slowly walked through the temple. The tiredness and resentment these days had miraculously lessened. He didn't know if it was the wondrous atmosphere of the Qing temple itself or if it was the quiet space. It was so quiet that it made one lazy to think. Very naturally, he walked to the back of the temple. Fan Xian's figure suddenly froze. He saw an ascetic monk wearing hemp clothing and a straw hat looking at him with furrowed brows at the door of the small building in the back of the temple. Fan Xian wanted to retreat, but the ascetic monk opened his mouth. The moment he opened his mouth, it was filled with admiration. His hands pressed together toward the raindrops in the sky. He sighed and said, "The will of heaven has its own encounters. Master Fan, we have always wanted to go find you. Unexpectedly you have come." Having his true identity seen through, Fan Xian's expression did not change. Calmly, he looked at the ascetic monk and quietly said, "You? Why are you looking for me?" The ascetic monk held a bell in his right hand. He gently rang it. The clear sound of the bell quickly pierced through the fine rain and spread throughout the entire Qing temple. Just like the first time Fan Xian had come to the Qing temple, there was no incense burning in the temple. Other than tourists from various provinces, probably no one wanted to come here. Thus, the Qing temple was still quiet. The clear sound of the bell did not cause any unusual movement. It only attracted a dozen ascetic monks. Wearing the same style of hemp clothing and similar old straw hats, the ascetic monks walked out from all directions of the Qing temple and faintly surrounded Fan Xian in the center, just below the round tower. Fan Xian slowly took a deep breath and began to slowly circulate the Xueqi meridians that had never stopped in the 2 circulations in his body. Coldly, he looked at the ascetic monk in front of him and calmly said, "This temple has always been quiet. You are not preaching under heaven. Why have you come back to disturb the peace here?" Sir Fan has a kind heart and is deeply endowed with the virtue of heaven. In Jiangnan, you cultivate in Hangzhou and gather the wealth of the world to enrich the river works. We useless people travel through various provinces and have heard of Sir's benevolence and seen much of Sir's kindness. We have long hoped to meet you. The ascetic monk lowered his head in greeting. He had always called Fan Xian Sir Fan, and not Sir Fan. That was because everyone in Jingdo knew that all of Fan Xian's official positions had been stripped by the emperor. "I don't think you have come specially to praise me." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and furrowed his brows slightly. He had truly not thought that when he entered the temple to take a look, he would encounter such a group of strange people. Was it truly as the ascetic monk had said, that everything was fated? However, these strange ascetic monks truly seemed to have come specially to praise Fan Xian. They took off their straw hats and respectfully knelt down in front of Fan Xian in the center. Bowing, they sincerely praised and prayed for blessings. Fan Xian's expression was indifferent, but his heart was greatly shaken. The fine rain and the sound of praying mingled together. The atmosphere was very strange. The ascetic monks did not have the habit of wearing shoes. Their rough feet had been soaked in the rain until they were white. They knelt together on the wet ground and looked as laughable as frogs. However, the powerful aura emanating from their bodies and the words they said were not laughable. This powerful aura was the aura of these dozen ascetic monks after they had harmonized. It was so pure that no one dared to underestimate it. Sincere words like chanting a mantra rang out in the rain, accompanied by a dozen shiny bald heads in the rain. It was very annoying. For the sake of the people of the world, we beg that Sir Fan enter the palace to ask for forgiveness and comfort the emperor's heart. Fan Xian's face paled slightly. In an instant, he knew what these ascetic monks wanted to do. The estrangement and dispute between the Qing emperor and Fan Xian, ruler and official father and son, had already continued for 7 days. Neither side had shown any signs of retreat. For the sake of the people of the world? Naturally, someone had to admit their wrongs, and someone had to retreat. The Qing kingdom could only allow one dazzling leader. In the eyes of these ascetic monks, this person was the great emperor. The ascetic monks acutely sensed the Qing kingdom's greatest danger. For some reason, they decided to persuade Fan Xian on behalf of the emperor. In their hearts, and even in the hearts of the people, as long as Fan Xian once again returned to the emperor's light, the Qing kingdom and the world would certainly have an even better future. What if I am not willing? Fan Xian looked at these monks he had not had much contact with and asked quietly. There was a death-like silence. Only the fine rain continued to fall, landing on the ascetic monks' bald heads. The rain on the eaves dripped onto the stone tiles of the Qing temple. After a long time, a dozen voices, thick and thin, big and small, but all of them were incomparably determined and holy, rang out. For the sake of the people of the world, please rest in peace. Chapter 7:13. For the sake of all life under heaven, please rest in peace. Hearing these words in the rain, Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh. His laugh was not exaggerated. The corners of his delicate and pretty face that was half exposed outside the hat curled up slightly, carrying a glimmer of disdain and a glimmer of absurdity. This was his truest reaction in his heart. Probably even he had not thought that entering the Qing temple in the rain would meet these ascetic monks. Furthermore, the temperament these ascetic monks exuded was so strange. What was the temple? There were not many people in the world who knew. The only person who had some understanding of that indistinct place was, without question, Fan Xian, who had accompanied Xiao En in death. In the days after his rebirth, he had guessed this question more than once. However, he had never been able to find any fundamental answers. Fan Xian knew many of the priests, ascetic monks, and monks who served the temple. Among them the most famous was, without question, the imperial advisor of northern Qi, the person in charge of Tianyi Dao, Master Xueqi. Presumably, even Master Xueqi would not think that he had accepted the will of the temple and would punish on behalf of heaven just because he pitied the toil of the common people. Yet, the ascetic monks in the rain in front of him were serious and resolute in saying such words. Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh coldly to himself. Why must it be me who rests in peace, and not someone else? Fan Xian slowly withdrew the smile on his face. Looking at the ascetic monks around him, he calmly asked, if there is a god in the world, presumably in his eyes, all life is equal. Since that is the case, why must you target me? Could it be that the ascetic monks who serve the temple are nothing more than scoundrels who bully the weak and fear the strong? These mocking words clearly had no effect on the ascetic monks. They continued to kneel calmly around Fan Xian's body as if they were worshipping him. However, the pure aura that had already condensed into one had already firmly controlled Fan Xian's figure in the field. It's not difficult for me to enter the palace to ask for forgiveness, but I need an explanation. Why am I the sinner? Fan Xian slowly pulled off the rain hat connected to his collar and allowed the weak raindrops to slowly flow down his smooth black hair. Seriously, he said, I originally didn't know that you, who were so unknown, were such fanatics. I can also understand the meaning you didn't say. It is nothing more than to unify the world and dispel decades of unease and the fires of war so that the people can live in peace. I don't understand. What makes you think that man will be able to perfectly fulfill your hopes and carry out the will of the temple? Fan Xian turned his body slightly and felt that the heavy atmosphere around him was like a living thing. It was very smooth, without a trace of stagnation, nor did it reveal any loopholes that could be exploited. He raised his eyebrows slightly. He had not thought that these ascetic monks would be able to combine their individual realms of power to form such a powerful force when they worked together. Perhaps this was the reason the emperor had summoned these outwardly wooden but inwardly fanatical ascetic monks back to Jingdo. From the first step into the Qing temple, if Fan Xian wanted to escape the encirclement of these ascetic monks, he should have reacted at the first instant. However, he had already missed that opportunity and sunk into a heavy encirclement. Perhaps he had underestimated the power of the ascetic monks. More importantly, it was because he wanted to talk to the ascetic monks. Through these conversations, he could understand some things he wanted to understand, such as why the ascetic monks of the Qing temple supported the Qing emperor with all their might, completely ignoring the pressure the court and royal palace had put on the Qing temple these years, and whether or not the emperor had any connection to that illusory temple. In the rain, a dozen ascetic monks changed from kneeling to sitting cross-legged. They continued to surround Fan Xian in the center. Their expressions were wooden. It was as if they were no longer bothered by external things. There was a long silence. Perhaps these ascetic monks still hoped that Sir Fan could be convinced by them and not cause the Qing kingdom, which was about to unify the world, to sink into turmoil. Thus, a voice rang out in front of Fan Xian. An ascetic monk put his palms together. Raindrops hung on his weak eyelashes. He said slowly, Your Majesty is a person who has received the heavenly revelation. We wanderers should help Your Majesty unify the world and benefit the people. Tianqi? When? Fan Xian asked with his hands behind his back. His expression did not change as he stared at the ascetic monk's old face. He could easily see that these ascetic monks were not young anymore. Decades ago. A voice rang out from behind Fan Xian. The answer was very vague. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and began to think quickly. Did an envoy pass on the temple's will to you? Fan Xian asked. Yes. This time, it was another ascetic monk who answered. His answer was clean and tidy, without the slightest hesitation. However, this answer made Fan Xian's eyes narrow even more. The temple occasionally sent an envoy to the world. This was in itself one of this land's greatest secrets. If he had not grown up by Uncle Wu Zhu's side and learned so many secrets from Xiao En and Chen Pingping, he would not have been able to ask these questions. However, these ascetic monks were not surprised to hear the word envoy from Fan Xian. It was as if they had long expected that Fan Xian knew some of the temple's secrets. This matter surprised Fan Xian. But the great priest is dead. Sancher is also dead. Your companions on Dong Mountain are also dead. Fan Xian continued to speak calmly. Even the autumn rain could not hide the viciousness and mockery in his tone. Who wouldn't die? Then why didn't you die? Because the emperor still needs us. It sounds like you are very much like the girls in my brothel. The atmosphere in the Qing temple in the rain was strange. Fan Xian continued to calmly and continuously ask questions. The ascetic monks sitting around him each answered his questions. Their answers were wooden, steady, and orderly. They opened their mouths one by one. Of the 16 people present, it was as if only one person answered. Fan Xian's heart gradually sank. It looked like these strange ascetic monks had practiced hard for many years and had reached a powerful realm in the art of connecting their minds. What chilled him even more was the information regarding the emissary of the temple. The last time the temple envoy had come to the world was in the 5th year of the Qing calendar. This envoy had come ashore from the south. Along the way, he had indifferently learned the customs and habits of human society like a wild beast. In the process of this habit, many people in the southern provinces of the Qing kingdom had died at the hands of this envoy. Perhaps it was a habitual indifference to life, or perhaps this envoy wanted to hide the news of his existence. In any case, the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice had paid a great price and still hadn't been able to touch even a corner of this mysterious envoy's clothing. At the time, the Qing court only saw this person as a ruthless criminal with superb martial skills and didn't know his true identity. That was why the Ministry of Justice later asked the Overwatch Council for help. Yan Bingyun was cautious and asked Fan Xian to borrow the Tiger Guard. Before the Overwatch Council could act, this temple envoy had already arrived in Jingdo. He came to the alley beside the Fan Manor and was stopped by Wu Zhu beside a noodle stand. After a battle between commoner grandmasters, the temple envoy died and Wu Zhu was heavily injured. He disappeared and spent many years recovering on Dong Mountain. The remains of this emissary of the temple were burned in the Qing temple. Fan Xian's gaze passed through the curtain of rain toward the barren plain behind the Qing temple. His gaze was slightly cold. He thought of the scene of the emperor and the great priest looking at the temple envoy in the fire. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The great priest of the Qing temple had been preaching in the swamps and wastelands to the south of the Qing kingdom. Coincidentally, he returned to the capital not long before the temple envoy entered the capital. Then, not long after the envoy melted into the fire, he died of a serious illness. Was this a coincidence? Of course not. At least, Fan Xian didn't believe it. The matter of Uncle Wu Zhu being injured and the arrival of the emissary of the temple were things he only learned later. After a long time, he could only vaguely find this far. At least, it proved that the emperor had certainly reached some kind of agreement with the emissary from the temple through the great priest of the Qing temple. In the 5th year of the Qing calendar, the emperor hoped to use his illegitimate child as bait to lure the temple envoy and Uncle Wu Zhu into mutual destruction. However, he did not achieve his goal. In order to bury this matter and not let Fan Xian know of it, the great priest had to die. Fan Xian withdrew his gaze and looked at the ascetic monks in front of him. Naturally, he thought of the so-called Tianqi and the will transmitted by the temple emissary. That emissary was presumably the one who came to the Qing kingdom 22 years ago. Looking at it now, that envoy had not only moved Uncle Wu Zhu out of Jingdo, he had also represented the illusory temple and reached some kind of cooperation with the emperor. Cooperation between the emperor and the temple? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. The first time they worked together, they killed Yi Qingmei. The second time they worked together, they almost killed Uncle Wu Zhu. Everything was actually already very clear. The only thing he didn't understand was why the temple, which ostensibly did not interfere in worldly affairs, would make such a choice in the human world. The ascetic monks surrounding Fan Xian in the Qing temple were all rather old. Over 20 years ago, they had already learned of the temple's will. In their wild joy, they had loyally thrown themselves into the ranks of the Qing emperor's service. During these 20 years, they had walked among the people, spreading what should be good teachings. They ate one mouthful at a time, drank one ladle at a time, and lived a hard but peaceful life. At the same time, presumably, they were also acting as secret agents for the emperor. Dongyi had submitted, the civil strife had been quelled, Chen Pingping had died, the weather was favorable, the people were at peace, the country was rich, and the army was strong. The Qing kingdom's power had reached its peak. Other than Fan Xian, it seemed that there was no one else who could stop the Qing emperor's march to unify the world. Thus, these ascetic monks returned to Jingdo and prepared to welcome that dazzling moment. Thus, the ascetic monks wanted to persuade Fan Xian to forget his personal grudge for this great cause. For the sake of the righteousness of the world, he would forget one person's sorrow. Fan Xian stood alone in the rain. Although the rain was light, It still gradually soaked through his clothes. These ascetic monks frankly told him what they had done these 20 years and explained the secrets hidden behind the Qing kingdom's history. They sincerely wanted to persuade him. They wanted to use the will of the temple, the people's submission, and the direction of the general trend to persuade Fan Xian not to make an enemy of the emperor. The emperor was a wise ruler chosen by heaven and the ruler of the world. It's all nonsense. Fan Xian shook his head helplessly and wiped the rain from his face. Looking at the ascetic monks around him who were pleading with him, he said, "What exactly does this have to do with me? I'm just an official of His Majesty. No, I'm just a commoner now. I don't think anyone in the world would think that I can affect the general situation of the world. Isn't it a bit overreacting to force me into the palace or to send me to the grave?" The ascetic monks met each other's eyes and saw the caution and determination in each other's eyes. They did not believe Fan Xian's words. One of them looked at Fan Xian and said sincerely, "Because you are her son." Fan Xian was silent. He finally knew why the great array in the Qing temple had come. If the ascetic monks in the Qing temple served the temple loyally and saw the emperor as a leader chosen by heaven, then without question, Yi Qingmei, the young girl who had escaped the temple and stolen many things from the temple, was their greatest enemy. Perhaps these ascetic monks did not know the inside story and did not need to know. They only needed the temple emissary from 20 years ago to determine the nature of Yi Qingmei's actions for them to be deeply afraid of the woman who dared to look down on the temple. This kind of fear continued until 20 years later, when it extended to Fan Xian. "If you kill me, what will the emperor think?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "I think he must be very unwilling to see his son die in the hands of you swindlers. I am very worried for you." All of the ascetic monks saluted in unison with unswerving expressions on their faces. No one replied, but the meaning they expressed was clear. For the sake of their goal, even if the emperor killed them all afterward, they would keep Fan Xian here forever. "I've heard everything I wanted to hear." The corner of Fan Xian's mouth twitched and he said with slight mockery, "I think that if I agree to enter the palace, presumably you won't be at ease and will place some restrictions on my body. Of course, I can feign civility and agree to it first. At least I can keep my life. It's just that you've misjudged one thing." Fan Xian gazed at them coldly and said, "I believe in the existence of the temple more than you do. It is precisely because of this that my legs will not weaken the moment I hear the name of the temple and kneel in the rain like you." An ascetic monk sighed deeply and said, bemoaning the state of the universe and pitying the fate of mankind, "People are born in this world and must always be fearful. The emperor once said these words to me." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and thought to himself that it was clear that the emperor did not fear anything. The temple? Emissary? These existences that mortals saw as illusory and terrifying were probably nothing more than a kind of power that could be used in the emperor's eyes. "Respect the heavens and the earth, but you cannot respect the will of others," Fan Xian said. "Concerning this point, you should learn from Master Ku He." The ascetic monks were slightly surprised. They did not understand what these words meant. However, they saw Fan Xian, surrounded in the center, float up. Fan Xian floated up in the fine autumn rain. The cloth robes on his body were slowly held up by Xueqi. Like a heartless bird with a sudden sound, he swept toward the outskirts of the Qing temple. Without any warning, it was as if Fan Xian's body was being pulled by an invisible long rope and floated toward the main doors of the Qing temple with astonishing speed. His speed in the air was incomparably fast, and his movements were particularly gentle. He moved through the rain like a swallow, rolling and floating away in the wind and rain. However, his body had only swept out 50 feet when he felt an incomparably thick wall of air pouncing toward him. The moment Fan Xian made his move, a dozen ascetic monks moved at the same time. One ascetic monk put his arm around another ascetic monk's shoulder. With a muffled grunt, he tossed the companion beside him out. 6 or 7 consecutive movements were executed smoothly. It was as if their minds had long been connected. These movements did not show any signs of being sluggish or out of place. The ascetic monk's formation was an irregular circle. At this moment, they were tossed together. 7 people were quickly tossed toward the main doors of the Qing temple. In the air, their hands did not leave, causing the ascetic monks below to move at the same time. It was like a wave. The irregular circle formed by a dozen ascetic monks instantly became one. It flipped in the drizzling air and rose into the air. Using the wave-like aura, it leaped over Fan Xian's rapidly flying figure and once again trapped him in the circle. A circle flipped in the air and then landed on the ground. It was still a circle. Fan Xian was still in the center of the circle. After a moment, the rain continued to fall. The situation did not seem to have changed at all. Other than everyone moving about 70 feet toward the main doors of the Qing temple, the ascetic monks did not give Fan Xian any chance to attack first. They chanted in unison. Countless pairs of powerful Xueqi and determined palms slammed toward Fan Xian's body. No one knew what secret method the ascetic monks practiced to be able to connect their minds and perfectly merge their true power together. The countless palms slammed forward like a shining god. In an instant, countless pairs of divine hands appeared. Indifferently and mercilessly, they wanted to eliminate the demon in front of them. All of the space around Fan Xian was covered by the shadows of palms that blocked out the sky and the rain. It was like a large net falling down. It was impossible to see any gaps. This was the so-called beauty of harmony. When beautiful to the extreme, it was dangerous to the extreme. The wall of qi crashed toward him. Fan Xian forcefully twisted his body in the air. He forcefully absorbed the flow of air around him that he could feel from every inch of his skin. He forcefully circulated 2 great circulations. His body was forced to land on the ground, but the tip of his foot touched the wet ground. Tyrannical Xueqi gathered in his fist. He threw a punch toward the most powerful point in the thick wall of qi. In the instant that he was forced back into the harmonious situation, Fan Xian deeply smelled the scent of danger. 8 days ago, he had charged into the Jingdo execution field. He had stabbed an ascetic monk to death and forced back another. At the time, he had also paid the price of being hit 3 times. However, it was clear that the ascetic monks on the execution field had not displayed their greatest power. Fan Xian knew where the ascetic monks' power lay. It was in their ability to perfectly gather their individual power into one. This was not a group fight. It was not even the perfect teamwork of the Sword Hut disciples. On the contrary, it was more like the murderous light condensed between the Tiger Guard's long knives. When these ascetic monks formed a harmony, regardless of which ascetic monk Fan Xian faced, it was the same as facing them as a whole. In Fan Xian's eyes, the invisible wall of qi in front of him was as clear as a wall of white fog of varying thicknesses. He did not consider the consequences at all. He directly gathered all the Xueqi in his body and struck out with a tyrannical force. The place he struck was the thickest part of the wall of qi. Using the strongest against the strongest, Fan Xian completely ignored the shadows of the palms that filled the sky. He knew that given his present strength, the other party would have to gather all of them together in order to be able to stand up to them. This was probably the rare powerful aura that a warrior had nurtured after experiencing a lot. As expected, Fan Xian struck out violently toward the wall of qi. The palms that filled the sky immediately disappeared. The shadow of one hand and the shadow of another quickly merged into one. Dozens of palms finally merged into one, a sparkling and glowing palm. This palm collided viciously with Fan Xian's tightly clenched fist. The air in the Qing temple seemed to change shape with this collision. The fine drifting autumn rain was shaken into the air. On the large plain, not a single drop of rain could fall. The entire air was filled with a dry and murderous aura. After a loud crash, the clothes on Fan Xian's right shoulder were torn to shreds and flew up like butterflies, revealing his trembling right arm. The face of the ascetic monk he was facing was strangely red and bright. There were 2 arms on each of his shoulders. A dozen ascetic monks were endlessly channeling Xueqi into his body along this bridge of qi to help him resist Fan Xian's tyrannical punch. Fan Xian's face was deathly pale. The Xueqi in his body spat out violently, but he was still unable to break through his opponent's encirclement. The Xueqi coming from his opponent's palm was endless. It was like a wave, imposing, and incomparably turbulent. It gave one a feeling that it was difficult to resist. With a splat, the ascetic monk facing Fan Xian's palm spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. It dripped down along his clothes. However, the ascetic monk's face grew redder and brighter. There was no sign of exhaustion or of being unable to bear the majestic Xueqi in his body. He only carried a trace of pity as he looked at Fan Xian in front of him. It was as if he was waiting for him to admit defeat, disperse his martial arts, and submit. The ascetic monk walked and cultivated painstakingly in the most bitter places in the world. The tempering of the body and spirit indeed created an extraordinary cultivation. Signs of defeat had already appeared, but Fan Xian's eyes remained icy cold. There was not a trace of panic. There wasn't even the excitement of fighting for his life. There was only calmness. Calmly, he looked at the ascetic monk close to him and stared into his shining eyes. It was as if he wanted to see the color he hoped for in his eyes. Only Fan Xian knew that with just this exchange of fist and palm, the meridians in his body had been shaken to an unbearable state. His large and small circulations spun rapidly as he desperately exhaled Xueqi along his fist. He was almost unable to hold on. In particular, the vital point of the mountain at his waist was beginning to heat up faintly. It was a sign of exhaustion. After all, it was an injured and weak body. Fan Xian's most vital point was there. He had only rested for a few days in the Fan Manor. During these few days, he had viciously used martial arts to kill people. His state of mind had not calmed down. He had not recovered to his peak. Fortunately, his meridians were different from those of a normal person. He had one more circulation than a normal person. That was why he could use his weak body to hold on for so long in front of the ascetic monk's harmonious power. If it had been 13th Wang or Hai Tang, they probably would not have fared better than him. However, Fan Xian still did not panic or despair. He only looked coldly into the ascetic monk's bright black eyes. Finally, just as Fan Xian was about to be unable to hold on, a wretched green color finally appeared in the eyes of the ascetic monk close to Fan Xian's fist and palm. It was a wretched green color that was completely at odds with the eyes of a normal person. Then, 2 streams of black blood slowly flowed out of the ascetic monk's nostrils. The ascetic monks around Fan Xian did not notice this. They only sat cross-legged in the surroundings with their heads lowered in meditation, endlessly activating the resilient Xueqi in their bodies. A glimmer of understanding flashed through the wretched green eyes of the ascetic monk with the black blood flowing out. Glancing at Fan Xian, he finally understood why the young man in front of him was willing to listen to their pleas earlier in the rain. He was using this autumn rain to spread the poison. The ascetic monk finally remembered Fan Xian's true teacher. He was the last disciple of that old poisonous creature. The ascetic monk felt as if his internal organs were being bitten by insects. His throat began to hurt, and the corners of his eyes began to grow numb. He knew that the poison in his body was beginning to act up. If he stopped now, presumably, he could use the Xueqi in his body to suppress the poison. However, it was impossible for a colorless, odorless, and insoluble poison powder to be too terrifying. This was an innate principle of nature and common sense that all martial cultivators knew. The ascetic monk also knew this. Thus, he was not worried about his fellow disciples. Other than him, who had faced Fan Xian head-on and thus had the poison take effect the fastest, the other disciples should be able to hold out longer. The ascetic monk did not want Fan Xian to leave because he had already discovered that Fan Xian could not hold on much longer. A glimmer of peace flashed through his wretched green eyes, as well as a glimmer of determination. With a muffled grunt, he completely abandoned the defense of his state of mind and opened up all of his meridians, allowing the Xueqi to pour in from both sides. Then, he pushed it along his arm toward Fan Xian's bare right arm. All of it was done in one palm. He was willing to use his death to exchange for Fan Xian's death and the prosperity of the Qing kingdom. However, Fan Xian was not willing. A biting coldness flashed through his eyes. He knew that the ascetic monk had forcefully activated his Xueqi. The poison had entered his heart and could no longer be saved. He sunk his Xueqi into his lower body and relaxed his right shoulder slightly. Using the power of the coffin breaker technique, he prepared to use his right arm to exchange for the death of the ascetic monk, the eye of the array, and then escape. Faced with this dangerous situation of death, Fan Xian had the willpower and courage to break his arm to survive. Other than Fan Xian, there were other people in this world who did not want to see Fan Xian die. The heart-chilling circle in the autumn rain rolled in a circle in the air. It was getting closer to the front door of the Qing temple. At this most dangerous moment, the 2 words on the sign behind the Qing temple's front door suddenly dimmed. It was not that the sky had dimmed or that the 2 golden words had suddenly rusted. Rather, a shadow floated up and covered some of the light from the 2 words. In an instant, the shadow passed through the rain and floated to the back of the ascetic monk facing Fan Xian without any obstruction. Miraculously, the shadow spread out behind the man's neck. 4 limbs grew out and a sword grew out. With a hiss, the tip of the sword pierced into the ascetic monk's neck like a venomous snake and came out through the soft bones of his throat. The sharp blade had already cut through the ascetic monk's windpipe, esophagus, and blood vessels. The ascetic monk did not make any sound. He only stared fixedly at Fan Xian in front of him. The wretched green in his eyes was very strong, but his pupils did not shrink. It was as if he wanted to use his gaze to kill Fan Xian in front of him. At the same time the shadow formed the sword, Fan Xian's empty and powerless left hand rose up with difficulty. His fingertips dug slightly, and the hidden crossbow bolt broke out of his sleeve. It pierced deeply into the ascetic monk's left eye, sending up a spray of blood. This ascetic cultivator had the lifetime cultivation of a dozen ascetic cultivators gathered on his body. He was extremely powerful and thick. However, when he was attacked by two vicious killing moves at the same time, he still paused in the end. It was this pause that allowed Fan Xian's left arm to twist strangely. His shoulder shook and swung. The coffin breaker came out again and viciously smashed the end of the hidden crossbow bolt, smashing it deep into the ascetic monk's brain. The tip of the bolt went deep and ended his life. With a whoosh, the rain became chaotic. The ascetic monk, who had sacrificed himself for benevolence, lowered his hand in disappointment. Fan Xian opened his fist into a palm and brushed it against the top of his head. His entire body floated up. His left hand grabbed the shadow's clothes. Using his fastest speed, he sliced through the rain and left the Qing temple in an instant. From the time the two small golden characters on the horizontal plaque behind the Qing temple's main door dimmed to the shadow's attack and Fan Xian's floating body leaving the temple in a harmonious manner, only a blink of an eye had passed. The shadow's ruthless attack had not stopped, but Fan Xian did not allow his sword to enter a harmonious state again. Forcefully going against the flow, he left hand in hand with him. It was only at this moment that the ascetic monk sitting cross-legged in the rain realized that something had changed. The ascetic monk in the center of the harmonious situation had already lowered his hand. He could no longer speak, but he continued to passively accept the infusion of power from his fellow disciples. His body abruptly trembled a few times in the rain and then fell down without a sound. The shadow had pierced through his neck, and Fan Xian's crossbow had pierced his brain. The poison had already entered his heart. In the end, he had suffered a backlash from the harmonious situation. Without question, this ascetic monk was dead. He could not be more dead. The rain was already heavy and chaotic, randomly hitting the bodies of the ascetic monks. They silently looked at their comrade's body. A moment later, they bowed in silence and quickly jumped out of the Qing temple, chasing after the two figures that were about to disappear into the distance in the streets. No one knew if they would reflect on this. If the temple's edict was truly the will of heaven, then why were they unable to kill Fan Xian after putting in so much effort and even being willing to sacrifice their lives for a righteous cause? In the heavy autumn rain, Fan Xian and the shadow were like two gray shadows moving swiftly through the rain, under the eaves, in the dim sky, and through the silent streets. Not long after leaving the Qing temple, Fan Xian sensed that the clearly discernible aura behind him had caught up. Jingdo's Qing temple was 3 li outside. Usually, it was a very quiet place. Very few people passed by, and there were no private residences around that could be used. Today was another heavy rain, so there were no pedestrians taking shelter from the rain on the streets. This brought great inconvenience to Fan Xian and the shadow's escape. Fan Xian's pale face was covered in rainwater. He turned his head to glance at the middle-aged man beside him but did not see any expression on his face. Fan Xian knew that in the end, he had still underestimated those fanatical martyrs and the power of the divine path that had lasted for thousands of years on this land. In the past, perhaps it was because Master Ku He and Northern Chi's Tianyi Dao had stolen all the glory, or perhaps the ascetic monks of the Qing temple were not very eye-catching and only liked to preach in the most remote places, or perhaps the great and second priests of the Qing temple did not give people a sense of power. Fan Xian had never thought much of the Qing temple. However, today proved that this was a powerful enemy. Fan Xian even began to suspect that the knife formation the Tiger Guards used to defeat 9th-level aces was born from the miraculous combined attack of the Qing temple. Of course, if Fan Xian was still at his peak, he would not be in such a wretched state, particularly with his ability to escape so lightly. Born of the Overwatch Council, he and the Shadow, the foremost assassin in the world, would not think much of the pursuing ascetic monks. Normally, he and the Shadow would hide their tracks and turn to carry out the most sinister and terrifying ambush against these stubborn ascetic monks. However, he could not do so today. Because of the 1,000 li of running, the grief in his heart, the exhaustion of the days of hardship, and the heavy injuries he received on the walls of Zhangyang Gate and on the execution field, Fan Xian's condition had already fallen to rock bottom. Particularly when he had fought head-on against a dozen ascetic monks earlier, he no longer had the strength to fight back. The expression of the shadow beside him was cold and did not appear to be anything out of the ordinary. However, after many years of cooperation and closeness, Fan Xian could clearly see that the injuries on the shadow's body were also very serious, perhaps even more serious than his own. Fan Xian knew why. The shadow had only been injured once. That injury had been caused by Sigu Jian. After learning of Chen Pingping's death, Fan Xian could clearly guess what kind of reaction the shadow would have. He was clearly in Dongyi, but he had returned to Jingdo at almost the same time as Wang Qinian. The speed at which this foremost assassin returned was faster than Wang Qinian and possibly even faster than Fan Xian. With such a rush, the shadow's injuries had presumably worsened. Fan Xian tilted his head and glanced at the shadow but didn't say anything. Split up in front. The shadow spoke in a raspy voice. It carried a strange tone. It looked like this assassin also knew that their present situation could not be worse. They had to split up and divert the pursuing soldiers. Fan Xian nodded. He knew that if they split up now, the two of them would meet again soon. At the end of the street, the shadow suddenly passed into a small alley. Perhaps in a moment, he would become a wretched merchant hiding from the rain under the eaves. However, before he left, he coldly said something that made Fan Xian's heart sink. His mouth began to taste bitter. "When you are going to kill him, shout for me." Because of the impact these words had on his state of mind, Fan Xian ran a little further than he had planned. The ascetic monks behind him followed from a distance, but Fan Xian was not worried. He passed through a small alley and came to the intersection of Dongchuan Street. He entered the main hall of Donbo bookstore. When he came out through the back door, he had already become a scholar holding an umbrella. He came to the door of the Imperial College and saw hundreds of umbrellas, thousands of umbrellas, and the fresh-faced and sunny students under the umbrellas. Chapter 7:14. The last time he had come to the Imperial College was a few months ago. That day, the spring rain fell. Fan Xian had come to the Imperial College to see who the scholar about the matter of Sun Jingxiu, the Jingdo magistrate. At that time, he had returned to the capital with a peerless achievement. It had truly been glorious and glorious. He had resisted the pressure of the Hall of Governmental Affairs and humiliated Scholar He's will. He had been confident and arrogant, climbing to the second peak of his life. Once the rain stopped and the black umbrella fell, he was recognized by the students of the Imperial College and caused a small commotion. He had escaped from the Qing Temple in the bleak autumn rain. His face was slightly pale, and his arms trembled slightly. Some of the rain had leaked through the cloth umbrella and soaked his clothes, making him look somewhat wretched. Fan Xian had already been stripped of all of his official positions and titles. He had become a proper commoner. Furthermore, the entire Jingdo knew that the emperor was torturing this once glorious young man. The Fan Manor was like a house arrest. No one dared to come to his door or show their support. In a mere few months, his life circumstances had completely flipped around. Thinking of this, Fan Xian couldn't help smiling. Lowering his head and holding the umbrella, he walked past the Imperial College students who were discussing something and headed deeper into the Imperial College. In the rain, the Imperial College appeared particularly beautiful and quiet. Old trees stretched out their old branches on either side of the stone path, providing a rare comfort for the scholars running through the rain. Along the way, the autumn yellow had not yet risen, but the spring green was still there. At dusk, the school bell rang in the distance, clearing one's heart. Fan Xian no longer worried about the Qing Temple ascetic monks chasing him from behind. Putting aside whether or not they could find him while surrounded by hundreds of Imperial College students, the Imperial College was a sacred and important place. Even if the ascetic monks were willing to sacrifice themselves, they probably would not dare to charge in like a butcher and risk a commotion among the scholars. Holding the umbrella, he walked toward the Imperial College. After walking for a long time, he finally came to a relatively quiet place where the teachers were. Fan Xian habitually walked around the long corridor and entered a small courtyard. Passing by the screen wall, he slowly stopped his steps. This was his room in the Imperial College. A few teachers and talented students had been transferred under him. They had been editing books in this courtyard for a number of years. The carriage of books Sir Zhuang Mohan had given Fan Xian had been reorganized in this place and then sent to Xishan Paper Workshop for the final edition. In the end, It was sold at a fair price by the Fan Manor's Donbua bookstore. These years, the work of organizing books had continued, so the Donbua bookstore had been losing money the entire time. However, Fan Xian did not care about this. Just like how he had felt when he saw the bookshelves in Sun Pin Er's boudoir during the Jingdo Rebellion, Fan Xian thought that this kind of thing was meaningful. Since it was meaningful, he would continue to do it. He stood quietly by the screen wall and looked at the movement in the room. He was comforted to find that although the emperor had beaten him into a commoner, the Imperial College teachers and students who had followed him for a number of years had not been implicated. Furthermore, the work of editing books continued and had not been affected. A glimmer of warmth rose in Fan Xian's heart. He gazed into the room and smiled. Before the Imperial College teachers discovered him, he turned and left the familiar courtyard. Slanting through the small hill in the northeast corner of the Imperial College, he followed a shallow lake and came to another familiar courtyard. This courtyard and these rooms were where Xu Wu the scholar had lived when he taught. Later, Hu the scholar had been summoned back to Jingdo by imperial edict and squeezed in. After Xu Wu retired, this courtyard belonged to Hu the scholar alone. The last time Fan Xian had asked for Hu the scholar's help, it had happened in this courtyard. Fan Xian pushed open the door and entered. He bowed to the shocked officials and teachers. He then walked into the study alone, leaving behind the group of people looking at each other in dismay. Hearing someone push open the door and enter, Hu the scholar, who had been buried in his desk, raised his head. He quickly took off the crystal spectacles on the bridge of his nose. His face quickly changed to a solemn expression. The leader of the Qing civil officials was not in a good mood. Given his identity, Hu dared to barge in without summoning him. However, he saw a face he had never expected. After pausing for a moment, a trace of bitterness rose to the scholar's face. This is truly shocking. Fan Xian had actually not expected Hu the scholar to be in the room. He had been busy in Dongyi for a long time. He had somewhat forgotten his duties for the court meetings and the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He was also not sure whether or not this scholar would be at the Imperial College. However, he did have some things he wanted to talk about with someone. Since he had come to the Imperial College, he had to find this person. In court, the only person who could come into private contact with Fan Xian and not worry about being angrily dismissed by the emperor was probably this Hu the scholar. Some things happened today. I am not in a good mood, so I came to find you to chat. As Fan Xian spoke, he walked in the direction of the desk. The umbrella in his hand dripped water all the way. Hu the scholar furrowed his brows and pointed. Only then did he understand. Smiling, he placed the umbrella behind the door. Without a trace of politeness, he picked up the cup of warm tea on the table and took a few sips, warming his body that had been soaked through by the rain and ice in the Qing temple. How come you are so down and out and pitiful? Looking at the dripping Fan Xian snatching the hot tea to drink, Hu the scholar couldn't resist laughing. However, the smile disappeared as soon as it appeared. He found that this joke could easily be extended to other meanings. As expected, Fan Xian very naturally followed along with this topic and said, I am just a commoner now. To be able to drink the hot tea on the scholar's table, I have to treasure the opportunity. After these words were said, the quiet room immediately became silent. Neither of them spoke. Instead they sank into their own thoughts. Hu the scholar thought Fan Xian had come specifically to find him, so he had no choice but to be cautious. Each word and each action had to be carefully thought out before they could be expressed. After a long time, Hu the scholar looked at him and said, Why did you want to come out for a walk today? A strange smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. His voice was slightly cold. Has the palace ordered me to be confined? Hu the scholar smiled. Fan Xian continued warmly, Since there isn't, why can't I come out for a walk? In particular, His Majesty has stripped me of all my duties, but what is very wonderful is that he has left me a teaching position at the Imperial College that has no rank or rank. My coming to the Imperial College today can be considered to be considerate of His Majesty's wishes, to show that this commoner has no resentment. There was resentment in his words. If a normal official had said such words in front of Hu the scholar would certainly have harshly reprimanded them. Facing Fan Xian, he could only maintain his silence. Of course, the atmosphere of this conversation was completely different from the conversation in the spring rain. After all, although Fan Xian's words were fearless at that time, they were fearless with the emperor's permission. Hu the scholar could still join in the fun. Now, The emperor had withdrawn this permission. Hu the scholar's response was particularly difficult. He paused for a moment and then looked at Fan Xian. Seriously, he said, I am not very clear about your thoughts. Yesterday, when I entered the palace, I had a conversation with the emperor. When it came to the matter of the Fan Manor, the emperor had a comment about you. Fan Xian slowly raised his head and didn't ask. The calmness in his eyes did not match the confusion in his heart. Everything about Nji is good. It is just that his personality is too direct and stubborn. Hu the scholar glanced at him and took the teacup from his hand. Leaning slightly, he went to refill the tea on the little stove at the side. Hu the scholar had his back to Fan Xian. His voice was flat and indifferent. Quietly he said, direct and stubborn. It looks like the emperor understands you and is considerate of you. No matter how big a mistake, it can be washed away with these words. This is a problem of personality, not a problem of natural disposition. You have to understand the emperor's painstaking efforts. Painstaking efforts? Fan Xian's brows slowly furrowed. They were beautifully furrowed and cold. He understood what Hu the scholar's words represented. The man in the palace still had 30% hope and 30% tolerance for his illegitimate child. How much of the remaining 40% was anger and how much was fear? No one could say for sure. Hu the scholar turned his body and placed the teacup in front of Fan Xian. Looking into his eyes, he said seriously, direct and stubborn. This is a person of character. The emperor likes true lovers like you. It is not that the emperor cannot forgive you for the mistakes you have made these days. What is important is that you know where you went wrong and let the emperor know that you know your mistakes. Fan Xian sat silently in the chair. He knew that Hu the scholar had misjudged his intentions for coming today. However, it was impossible for the two of them to speak openly like they did in the past. He was not stupid enough to argue back. He only unconsciously and slowly said, Where did I go wrong? You know where it is. You need to show your attitude. Hu the scholar's brows furrowed. With slight worry, he said, Any of the things you have done these dozen days is enough for you to be struck into the dust and unable to rise again. The Black Knights have passed through the provinces. The memorials accusing you these days have flown into the Hall of Governmental Affairs like snowflakes. Probably the officials in these places still don't know that the emperor has long punished me. Fan Xian smiled. When has the emperor truly punished you? Hu the scholar's brows furrowed even deeper. Even the moisturizing cream he had to wear every day was almost unable to hide the deep wrinkles on his forehead. He looked at Fan Xian with a slightly disappointed gaze and said heavily, If you truly want to be punished according to Qing law, even if you have entered the body of the 8 deliberations, how many heads do you have to chop off? Can it offset these? Hu the scholar looked at the silent young man in front of him. For some reason, a fire of anger that was difficult to suppress rose in his heart. Lowering his voice, he scolded. Don't you understand that the emperor has already been sufficiently lenient toward you? If you continue to challenge the power of the court like this and sharpen the emperor's patience. So what? Fan Xian woodenly cut off Hu the scholar's words. Hu the scholar looked at him calmly. The disappointment in his eyes grew stronger and stronger. After a long time, he said in a raspy voice, Do you want to die? Fan Xian raised his head to look at him. Don't rely on the emperor's favor to continue making trouble without regard for the law and morality. It looked like Hu the scholar was truly angry. As the leader of the Qing civil officials, he had been like the other officials in court these days, watching as the emperor and Fan Xian turned against each other. He watched as the originally beautiful autumn scenery of the Qing kingdom added countless dark clouds because of this sudden change. As a high-ranking official of the Qing kingdom and a citizen of the Qing kingdom, they all wanted to persuade Fan Xian to enter the palace to ask for forgiveness and end this period of unrest. However, the attitude Fan Xian had displayed these days gradually chilled the hearts of everyone, including Hu the scholar. You think that I am just a favored official? Fan Xian did not want to brag about his abilities like a child. After hearing these words, he still couldn't resist furrowing his brows slightly and asking. It has nothing to do with favor. You are just an official. I am also an official. Hu the scholar forcefully suppressed his anger and faintly said, You and I are both the emperor's officials. Perhaps you think that the emperor does not treat you well. Think about it carefully. Since the founding of the country, which official has received such favor and trust from you? You have clearly seen the history of the country these years. You should know that the emperor has already shown you the greatest degree of tolerance and patience. Don't be blinded by your power. In the end, your power was bestowed upon you by the emperor. It's not that the emperor can't do anything about your ruthlessness these days. It's just that he doesn't want to, can't bear to, and doesn't want to make those decisions. It's not that he can't. Who the scholar slowly lowered his eyelids and said in a serious voice, "Of course, I have to admit that you are an exceptional official." Who the scholar did not finish because he wanted to tell Fan Xian that if the emperor truly did not have a sliver of leniency toward him, perhaps he would have long thrown him into prison or even executed him. The emperor had always had this ability. However, these involved the matters between the emperor and Fan Xian. Who the scholar's emotions surged. He realized that he had already said too much, so he silently changed the topic. No one wants to see a meritorious official of the Qing kingdom disappear from Jingdo because of his arrogance. Who the scholar looked at Fan Xian and said solemnly, "One must know when to turn back when one is lost. There has to be a limit to one's stubbornness." These words seem to have been said not long ago by many Baldies. Fan Xian smiled unhappily and straightened his body. Looks like the present Jingdo and the world all think that I am the little insect in front of the carriage of history. I should either quickly move out of the way or be crushed to death. If I have my own thoughts, then I am a sinner. He gradually withdrew his smile and thought of the group of wastrels he had crippled outside Baoyue brothel many years ago. He also thought of what Wan had once said was very similar to Who the scholar's. The emperor's patience, in the end, had a limit. Presently, he was trapped in Jingdo and could not leave. If someone wanted to kill or cripple him, it was only a matter of a word. This was different from the siege of the ascetic monks in the Qing temple. Once the Qing court truly decided to get rid of Fan Xian, this unstable factor, no matter how shocking Fan Xian's cultivation was, he would not be able to escape this fate. After all, he was not a great grandmaster. Earlier, when I braved the rain to enter the Imperial College and watched those scholars walk past me, I thought that perhaps one day, I would also become someone worthy of disdain in their eyes, Fan Xian said tiredly with his head lowered. No, no one has ever blamed you or disdained you. Not only these students, but even the officials and people in Jingdo have some respect for you when it comes to matters on the execution field. Who the scholar coughed and slowly said, "Just like the emperor's criticism of you, you displayed sufficient stubbornness in the matter of Director Chen. This kind of true nature can make many people understand you. However, you must learn to think through these things. The people respect you only because of your affection. However, if you really do something treacherous and heinous, then, however, if you truly have any treasonous actions, even thoughts." Who the scholar's voice became icy. "I cannot tolerate you. The court cannot tolerate you. The people cannot tolerate you. The emperor cannot tolerate you. You must understand. This is the unified will of the Qing court. I hope you won't mess around." Mess around? Fan Xian smiled, but there was a heavy pressure in his smile. Being the enemy of the world was not something he was afraid of. His heart was still thinking back to the thoughts in his mind earlier. He could not quite come back to his senses. After a long time, he bowed solemnly toward Who the scholar. He didn't say anything or give any information. He turned and walked toward the door. Although I don't want to admit it, I have to admit that I am already old. Who the scholar looked at Fan Xian's back and suddenly blurted out. Slowly he said, "The words I said today were a bit excessive. However, the world is not yet settled. The war cannot stop. For the officials in court and for the people under heaven, I hope you can think more." Who the scholar spoke from the bottom of his heart. He had been the emperor's purposeful choice to be the next prime minister. Following the changes in the situation in court, his prospects had become blurry. In order to oppose Fan Xian, the emperor had raised up He Zongwei. So he understood the emperor's heart and was skilled in government affairs. He was experienced and mature. It was impossible to find a single mistake. Now that Fan Xian's power had declined, He Zongwei had naturally secured his position in the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He had the emperor's trust and was popular for a time, faintly suppressing the Hu faction's limelight. Even if Who the scholar did not care for power and position, he would probably still sigh in his heart. His urging of Fan Xian was probably because he needed a familiar helper in court. Of course, the most fundamental reason was just as he had said earlier. The Qing kingdom, whose sharpness pointed at the world, needed a stable court and a harmonious society. Each day Fan Xian did not lower his head to the emperor, the Qing kingdom would not be at peace unless Fan Xian died. In reality, in the Qing court and in the streets, not many people wanted Sir Fan Jr., who had just accomplished a great deed, to die like this. I understand what you mean. Fan Xian didn't turn his head. After a long silence he said, "Perhaps one day I will think it through and enter the palace to ask for forgiveness." Behind him, Hu the scholar smiled bitterly and thought, "If I wait for you to think it through, how many years and months will that take?" Perhaps I was truly wrong? Fan Xian's figure at the door was very tired. He quietly muttered to himself in a slightly raspy voice. When these words landed in Hu the scholar's ears, it made his heart warm. His brows slowly furrowed. He decided to enter the palace again tonight. In his opinion, the dispute between the emperor and Fan Xian was not something that could not be resolved. It was just that no one wanted to lower their head first. If he could convince the emperor to send an edict summoning Fan Xian into the palace, perhaps Fan Xian would go with the flow. As he thought this, Fan Xian suddenly turned his head and said, "Although I am no longer in the Overwatch Council, I know a very interesting piece of news. Perhaps you would like to hear it." Hu the scholar raised his head slightly. Fan Wujiu is a strategist in Scholar He's manner. Fan Xian bowed again and walked out of the room. The rain in the Imperial College continued to fall unhurriedly. Under the umbrella, Fan Xian's calm face did not change in the slightest. He had already achieved his goal in his conversation with Hu the scholar. He knew exactly what the upper echelons of court officials thought of him. He also understood where the bottom line of the emperor's generosity toward him was. Of course, the most important thing was the last two sentences. Fan Xian held the umbrella and walked silently in the rain. He thought to himself that if it wasn't tonight or tomorrow, the palace would probably send out an edict summoning him into the palace. Through Hu the scholar releasing some kind of signal into the palace, perhaps he could hide it from the man on the dragon chair. All of this was because the people of the Qinian unit had just left the capital, so Fan Xian was not ready. He had to control this cold war between ruler and official to within the range of a spring failing. He was preparing at all times. That night, Hu the scholar entered the palace. No one knew what he said with tears and tears to the emperor, but the eunuchs serving in the royal study all knew that the emperor's mood should be much better. An edict was immediately sent out of the palace. The dark killing field outside the Fan Manor, which had been tormented for 7 days, came to an end. Until Scholar Hu left the royal palace with a peaceful and happy expression, he still did not tell the emperor the shocking news Fan Xian had told him. For one reason, he didn't understand why Fan Xian had told him such an important matter. Was there a hidden conspiracy behind it? For another reason, the Qing kingdom was like what Hu the scholar believed. What they needed was unity. In the Imperial College, he only felt that the name Fan Wujiu sounded familiar, but he couldn't remember who it was. After all, he was the head scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. In the time it took to drink a cup of tea, his subordinates found out that Fan Wujiu was one of the 8 generals of the second prince's manor. Walking out of the palace and into the carriage, Hu the scholar couldn't resist sighing. He gently stroked his beard and smiled. He thought to himself that Sir Fan Jr. was indeed a cute person who held grudges. Chapter 7:15. The Emperor waved his hand. The people outside the Fan Manor were all evacuated. This was the power of a feudal ruler. He could do as he pleased. As for the subordinates and officials who had died muddle-headedly outside the Fan Manor because of the battle between him and his father, who would care? The royal study was not quiet. After Hu the scholar left, the emperor began to play chess with Fan Ruoruo. This was a habit he had developed in recent days. The Qing emperor's index and middle fingers gently picked up a black piece and placed it on the slightly reflecting chessboard. Evenly, he said, "It looks like Fan Jian did not teach you these things in the manor." Fan Ruoruo had been in the palace for a full 8 days. She was wearing the casual clothes that the Fan Manor had gone to great lengths to send through a few concubines in the palace. They were mainly plain. Compared to the brilliance of the royal palace, they appeared light and incongruous. Although everyone knew that the young lady of the Fan family was a hostage in the palace, this hostage's status was not low. The emperor treated her even more well. Princess Chen managed things outside the palace. Inside the palace, there were nobles looking after her. There were no major problems with her food, daily life, and clothing. She sat respectfully across from the Qing emperor and placed her hands gently on her knees. She replied, "The path of chess is too complicated." The emperor raised his eyelids slightly and asked with interest, "I remember that before Nji entered the capital, you were already a famous talented woman in Jingdo." It was just those boorish men who liked to make trouble out of nothing who liked to make irresponsible remarks. "I can't compose poetry or paint. I really don't know where this talented woman's reputation came from." In her 8 days in the palace, she had gone from the initial nervousness, fear, and helplessness to now waiting quietly and calmly. Fan Ruoruo had fully released the calmness of an iceberg. For one, it was because of her personality from a young age. More importantly, it was because of Fan Xian's imperceptible influence over these dozen years. Although the man opposite her was the Qing emperor, he was still a person and not a monster. This was also because the emperor appeared particularly like a normal person in front of Fan Ruoruo. "I've seen your poems. They are not bad in the boudoir. However, compared to Nji, they cannot be compared." "No wonder you would say such things," the emperor said with a slight smile. Her Majesty smiled and said, "Talent does not lie in showing off one's various abilities, but in the steadfastness of one's heart. You saved my life, which can be considered a miracle. It is fitting to be called a talented woman. Your Majesty has a flood of good fortune. I am just." Fan Ruoruo naturally followed the tone of the emperor's words. Unexpectedly, the emperor smiled and said, "Of course I won't die, but I don't think it will be comfortable to have more steel balls in my body." Eunuch Yao quietly flashed into the royal study and stood in front of the emperor. In a quiet voice he said, "Someone died in the Qing temple. They are waiting in the front hall." "Wait, is it a punishment?" The emperor gently played with the black, matte chess piece. In a cold voice he said, "I will spare them this time. If they act rashly again, have them go jump off the cliff at Dong Mountain." Eunuch Yao agreed in a low voice and said, "After Sir Fan Jr. left the Qing temple, he went to the Imperial College and saw who the scholar." The emperor was silent for a moment. He then smiled slightly and said, "I already knew earlier. At the Qing temple, the shadow has returned." Eunuch Yao was silent. When it came to these matters, he did not have any power to make suggestions. He understood the emperor's intentions. He would not be as muddle-headed as those ascetic monks wearing straw hats. Who was Fan Xian? He was the emperor's favorite official and illegitimate child. Even if the emperor wanted Fan Xian to die, he would not let the people below him act on their own. The problem is, we still don't know how Sir Fan Jr. left the Fan Manor or how he entered the Qing temple. Furthermore, we don't know where he went during this period of time, Eunuch Yao said as he bowed slightly. The Qing emperor furrowed his brows slightly and didn't say anything. He waved his hand and had Eunuch Yao leave the royal study. During the course of this conversation, Fan Ruoruo listened quietly to the side. Eunuch Yao did not avoid her. These days, the servants in the palace had long gotten used to the emperor always having a girl with delicate features and a sense of calmness emanating from her body listening. Regardless of whether it was a royal study meeting or more important state affairs, the emperor did not avoid her. However, the person they were talking about was, after all, Fan Xian, her dearest brother. Thus, Fan Ruoruo still lowered her head slightly. It was as if she did not want to hear any of this. Furthermore, she did not want the emperor to discover anything strange. The emperor did not glance in her direction. He was silent. A moment later, the emperor suddenly smiled slightly. The internal court did not find any trace of what Fan Xian had done after risking his life to leave the manor. At least, they knew that the shadow of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council had returned. In the Qing temple, a dozen ascetic monks had fought a great battle with the two of them. Thinking of the bald ascetic monks, the smile on the emperor's face immediately faded. A glimmer of disgust rose to his eyes. He had not thought that these fanatical Qing temple cultivators would dare to attack Fan Xian without asking for the emperor's orders. This made the emperor feel a considerable amount of displeasure. Thinking of the shadow, the true head of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, the emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. A glimmer of interest appeared. Chen Pingping had served him for decades, but he had always kept many of his secrets. In the past, because the emperor deeply believed in his loyalty, he did not care much. Although he knew that there had always been a shadow floating by the side of the black wheelchair, the emperor did not investigate deeply into the shadow's true origins. Now he knew. A light flashed across the emperor's eyes. It was the sword light the white-clothed swordsman had sent out a few years ago in the Hanging Temple. This light was piercing to the eyes and made him narrow his eyes even more. He faintly hoped in his heart that Sigu Jian's youngest brother would do something. There was no need to consider what Fan Xian had done when he left the manor. The emperor knew that Fan Xian must have gone to contact his most trusted subordinates in Jingdo. At the same time, he had sent some important messages in the direction of Shiliang, Dongyi, and Jiangnan. This was a simple matter. If Fan Xian wanted to maintain his independence in front of the pressure of the dragon chair, he had to mobilize all of his power. However, the emperor could not be bothered to pay attention to the specific contents of the messages. In his opinion, no matter how Fan Xian jumped, he was still on this land. This land had always been in the Qing emperor's hands. Furthermore, the emperor was very curious about what his favorite and most admired son could do when he was under house arrest in Jingdo. If he was facing Yi Qingmei of the past, for the sake of the people of this land, for the survival of the entire Qing kingdom, and for the wishes of too many people, perhaps there would be no need for him to say anything. Yi Qingmei could only silently go far away and no longer exist on Qing kingdom soil. What choice would his and Yi Qingmei's son make? This was something the emperor was very interested in. Was this the evil interest of calmly watching the struggle of the next generation under a kind of absolute confidence? However, up until now, the emperor had never thought of throwing Fan Xian into the abyss. In his opinion, his son had only misunderstood him. The emperor just didn't want to explain. He didn't care to explain. This was a process of questioning his heart. He sat tyrannically in the palace and waited for Fan Xian to enter the palace to explain and beg for forgiveness. Only then would the emperor peacefully tell Fan Xian that the dead old black dog was not as benevolent as he imagined. That old black dog only wanted to kill the entirely royal family. He had once killed him. Although his surname was Fan, in reality, it was Li. Something like that? But how would he explain Yi Qingmei's matter? Perhaps the emperor did not want to touch on that. I want to go out for a walk, the emperor said. Although his voice was calm, it was clear that because of what the scholar had said when he entered the palace earlier, the emperor had some confidence in dealing with Fan Xian's matter. Thus, his mood was relatively relaxed. That was why he wanted to go out in the middle of the night. There were only 2 people in the royal study. Naturally, the emperor's words were for Fan Ruoruo to hear. Fan Ruoruo was slightly startled. She stood and took out a thin cloak lined with black fur and gold. Carefully putting it on for the emperor, she then supported his right arm and slowly walked to the side of the wooden door of the royal study. When the wooden door opened, there were already a dozen eunuchs and serving girls waiting outside. Eunuch Yao humbly lowered his body and pushed a wheelchair as he waited. From the time the emperor spoke to the time the eunuchs outside finished preparing everything, it had all taken a very short time. Their reactions were very fast. The emperor looked at the wheelchair outside the door and did not show a trace of admiration on his face. He only glanced coldly at Eunuch Yao and paid no attention to the servants outside. With Fan Ruoruo's support, he walked toward the royal palace in the night. Being stared at by the emperor coldly, Eunuch Yao's body was covered in cold sweat. 8 days had passed. Not many people knew that the battle between ruler and officials in the royal study had caused the emperor serious injuries. Although it was not life-threatening, the emperor's body had still suffered injuries that were difficult to recover from in a short time. Additionally, Chen Pingping's heart-wrenching words that day made the emperor's mental state not particularly good. Thus, Eunuch Yao had prepared this wheelchair. He had not expected that the emperor would be so unhappy. He immediately realized that regardless of whether it was because he did not want the officials to know the true state of his body, or because the wheelchair made him think of the old director who had made the emperor angry and pained, Eunuch Yao had made a big mistake. This kind of mistake could not be made. Fortunately, the emperor was a master who was more magnanimous towards servants than his own family. He would not easily shift his anger, so Eunuch Yao did not have to worry about his life. He wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead. Leading a group of eunuchs and serving girls, he quietly followed behind. Looking at the young lady of the Fan family gently supporting the emperor forward, no one dared to get too close. The lanterns hanging in the corridors of the royal palace were not very bright. They were only used to illuminate the stone path beneath their feet. Usually, once night fell, the nobles would shut themselves up in the palace and not come out. Only the eunuchs and serving girls who had work to do would walk along these quiet long corridors. Today, the slightly dim light shone on the emperor and Fan Ruoro's bodies, dragging out long and short shadows. It made the eunuchs and serving girls they met tremble with fear and hurriedly kneel by the side of the path. Just as eunuch Yao had guessed, the emperor's earlier displeasure was because of the wheelchair by the door of the royal study. Once he saw the wheelchair, the emperor naturally thought of the old black dog in the wheelchair, who often walked side by side with him in the royal palace in the dead of night. As if they were talking about family matters, they discussed the situation of the world, the internal strife of the royal family, drew up plans, and estimated the number of deaths. The Qing emperor was human. He greatly missed those scenes of the past. Because of this and Chen Pingping's betrayal, these beautiful scenes worth remembering suddenly had an extra layer of strangeness and disbelief. Thus, he felt angry. Other than anger, there was also a thread of complicated emotions in his heart. A few years ago, because of the Hanging Temple incident, Fan Xian had been heavily injured and almost lost his life. After he had recovered, that young man had also entered the palace in a wheelchair and talked with the emperor for a long time. That was the first time the emperor had spoken with Fan Xian. Although they still did not explicitly state their relationship and were not like the time in the little building, for the Qing emperor, it was still an important meeting. Seeing the wheelchair tonight, he thought of Chen Pingping and Fan Xian after his injury. His emotions became complicated. Slowly, he said, "The reason I wanted to cut that old dog to pieces was because he was extremely ruthless and extremely deceitful." Fan Ruoro held his arm and maintained a distance. She did not feel it was too tiring. Hearing these words, she felt that the emperor's body had become as heavy as Mount Tai. If a ruler wanted an official to die, the official had no choice but to die. In particular, Director Chen's rebellious actions were clear to the heavens and earth. No one could use this matter to question the emperor, other than Fan Xian. More importantly, the emperor did not need to explain anything. Just like these days, he never thought of taking the initiative to explain anything to Fan Xian. However, on this early autumn night, just as she and the emperor were alone, the emperor had spoken. Were these words meant for her to hear, or was he borrowing her mouth to say it to his brother? Fan Ruoro lowered her head slightly and didn't reply. She was thinking endlessly in her heart. In the end, that old dog purposely died at my hands so that Nji would resent and hate me. How could I allow such an evil person to die happily? The emperor's voice was slightly tired. He turned his head and glanced at Fan Ruoro. He then turned his head back and looked at the quiet palace. "Tomorrow, I will give an order for Nji to enter the palace to pay his respects." Fan Ruoro's figure froze slightly. With one hand holding the emperor's arm, she crouched down slightly and curtsied. Sincerely, she said, "Thank you, Your Majesty." The emperor's face was expressionless. It was as if he did not think that in this Cold War, he was the first to take a step back and still needed the daughter of an official to express her thanks. What moved him a little was that after the young lady of the Fan family said these 3 words, she did not say anything else. She only held his arm and continued to stroll through the palace. She did not say a word about her leaving the palace. "You are different." The emperor turned his head and glanced at her with deep meaning. "In the past, I often came with Chen to stroll through the palace. However, as she grew older, I came less often. Furthermore, she is much more mischievous than you. Naturally, I cannot compare to sister-in-law." Fan Ruoro lowered her head and replied quietly. The emperor smiled and didn't say anything. He felt that the little girl beside him was extremely light and boastful. However, it was also pitiful. Ever since Lin Wan had grown up, there were probably not many people who would accompany the emperor like a true junior. Because the emperor had no family matters, in the hearts of the princes, whether alive or dead, their father could never be a true father. Fan Ruoro's heart was also filled with confusion and emotion. After these days of interaction, this unfamiliar and incomparably dignified emperor seemed to gradually come down from the altar. He also took off the dazzling golden outer clothing and became more like a normal elder. Perhaps it was more accurate to say that he was an elder who had been seriously injured and was gradually showing signs of old age. In the quiet night palace, the young lady of the Fan family supported the emperor for a stroll. This scene fell into the eyes of many people. This was not the first time people had discovered that the emperor treated the young lady of the Fan family strangely. Ever since the emperor had been injured in the royal study and the young lady of the Fan family had entered the palace to be treated, everyone in the royal palace knew that the emperor treated her differently. Anyone with a bit of intelligence knew that the young lady of the Fan family was currently a hostage. However, There were no more hostages like that in this world. Her life in the palace followed Princess Chen's rules. Other than returning to the palace to rest at night, the young lady of the Fan family would spend the entire day with the emperor in the royal study. Even when the emperor discussed state affairs, he did not avoid her. The scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs were also shocked by this scene. However, they were all people of status, so they would not spread rumors. However, Scholar He's expression would often appear unnatural when he saw the young lady of the Fan family in the royal study. It was different inside the royal palace. There were many people and many mouths. For a moment, there was much discussion. Humans were always a forgetful species. Perhaps the eunuchs and serving girls in the palace had already forgotten the thunderstorm in the 7th year of the Qing calendar and the bloody purge in the palace because of rumors. They had once again thrown themselves into the great work of gossip. Perhaps it was because too many people had died 3 years ago. At this time, many new eunuchs and serving girls had entered the royal palace. They did not know the danger hidden in the royal family's bearing. Perhaps it was because the emperor's attitude toward the young lady of the Fan family was truly incomprehensible. Rumors about the royal study gradually spread throughout the royal palace. The emperor was a wise ruler who did not like women, and he did not seem like a licentious master. In these years, there had only been a dozen female masters in the royal palace, and only 4 had children. Logically speaking, no one would have guessed that. However, the emperor's attitude toward the young lady of the Fan family was truly different. In addition, there had been another major event in the royal palace in the last 2 days. It couldn't help but touch the hearts of too many people. This major event was the consort selection. The consort selection that had begun 3 days ago. The Qing royal palace had stopped consort selection activities for over a dozen years. No one understood why the emperor would suddenly have the idea of filling up the back palace at such a time. Was it because the crisis of approaching middle age had made this ruler suddenly think of a youthful madness? Starting from 3 days ago, the consort selection, hosted by Taichung Temple and coordinated by the Internal Court and the Ministry of Rights, began. Since the Qing kingdom was already unfamiliar with this entire process, the Ministry of Rights appeared to be in a panic. The 7 roads and provinces of the Qing kingdom had probably not received the edict yet. The women who might have been lucky enough to be selected into the palace had not heard any news. Thus, the first to move was still Jingdo. This was a rare opportunity. The nobles, officials, and famous scholars who had been dormant in Jingdo for too long all wanted to grasp this opportunity. Amidst this chaotic process, they still rushed to send the first batch of women of suitable age into the palace on the night before yesterday. Because of the arrival of the youthful and graceful women, the royal palace, which had been peaceful for many years, immediately gained a youthful and threatening feeling. Even though it was already night, clear laughter still rang out from the courtyards where the women were. The overflowing feeling of spring filled the palace at the beginning of autumn. Thus, the people in the royal palace cast suspicious gazes toward the royal study. If the emperor's heart was truly moved, how would the young lady of the Fan family, who had won the emperor's heart, be settled? They're all a group of idiots. Xueqi's eyelids drooped slightly. Gently pulling on the 3rd prince's hand, she smiled coldly and said, "Who is the emperor? Who is your teacher? How could such absurd words come out of the palace? Most of the people in the palace are idiots. Furthermore, there are too many new people. Perhaps they have already forgotten many things." The 3rd prince, Li Chengping, smiled. This young prince's smile was a bit forced. There was a faint worry between his increasingly bright brows. Xueqi looked at her son and sighed softly. His Majesty is a wise ruler. Naturally, he would not do such absurd things. The selection of beauties to enter the palace this time has nothing to do with that person in the royal study. Your father is only... Before she finished speaking, Li Chengping raised his head and looked at his mother. Gloomily, he said, "I heard that father will summon you into the palace tomorrow, but the selection of women... I'm afraid father will not be able to trust you as much as he did in the past." For the story, Fan Ruoruo's presence in the palace was a very important matter to prevent that person from becoming less and less human. As for the selection of women, it was a problem of the fertility machine. The Qing emperor was not an absurd person, but he was someone who planned far ahead. It was normal for the 3rd prince to be worried about this. Chapter 7:16. Hearing these words, Xueqi shook her head helplessly. Raising her slender fingers, she gently rubbed her slightly stuffy brows. She didn't know what to say. Of course, she knew what Li Chengping's words meant. However, as the emperor's concubine, she, a girl with an innocent and unaffected nature, was only able to sit safely in her current position because Lady Lu had urged her to be quiet before she entered the palace. In this chaotic situation, she couldn't say anything. The present royal palace had completely changed since 3 years ago. The Empress Dowager was dead, the Empress was dead, and the eldest princess was also dead. Lady Xu was secluded in the cold palace. During the Jingdo Rebellion, Yi Guipin, who had given birth to Li Chengping, and Ning the Talented, who had given birth to the Great Prince, followed Fan Xian and the Great Prince's bravery or being forced to stand on the emperor's side. With the rebellion, the two nobles rose in status. Ning the Talented was raised a level. Although Yi Guipin was still a Guipin, as she grew older, she would gradually be promoted to a Guifei. The imperial palace was managed by Yi Guipin and Lady Ning. Yi Guipin had a good temperament, and Lady Ning did not care about internal affairs. Naturally, the imperial palace was a peaceful place, and they lived 3 good years. However, 8 days ago, there was a loud crash in the imperial study, and the good days finally came to an end. Because Lady Ning had bravely pleaded for mercy on behalf of old Director Chen, she had been banished by the emperor to the cold palace to accompany Lady Xu. It was fortunate that she had given birth to a good son. Otherwise, given the emperor's anger that day, immediate death would have been the best result. Presently, Yi Guipin was the only noble mistress in the palace. The concubine selection that had begun 3 days ago was under her sole control. She understood the true purpose behind this sudden concubine selection better than anyone else. After the Jingdo Rebellion, the emperor still had 2.5 sons. Other than the Great Prince and Third Prince Li Chengping far away in Dongyi. The other half naturally referred to Fan Xian. Because of Chen Pingping's rebellion, Fan Xian and the emperor had sunk into a cold war. No one knew how this matter would end. These 2.5 sons had completely learned the lessons of the Crown Prince and Second Prince. The relationship between them was very close. Putting aside the friendship between the Great Prince and Fan Xian, even the teacher-student relationship between Fan Xian and the Third Prince was stronger than the emperor had expected. After the 7th year of the Qing calendar, Fan Xian had entered the palace many times. However, his contact with the Third Prince had decreased. One reason was because the Third Prince was clearly the heir apparent, so he had to avoid suspicion. The other reason was that the emperor had purposely weakened Fan Xian's influence on the Third Prince. Even if Fan Xian was completely useless, he had one strength that everyone admired. It was his ability to influence the people around him and make them focus their hearts on him. Regardless of whether it was some of the officials close to the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian's 4 disciples, or the troops in Baoyue brothel, they all proved this point. The Third Prince was his student. Although he had seen little of Fan Xian after returning from Jiangnan, he had not forgotten Fan Xian's teachings. He had long changed from the sinister and ruthless child of the past to a reserved prince. There was no internal strife or jealousy between the 3 princes. If this had happened in the past, this would have been a wonderful thing. After the Jingdo Rebellion 3 years ago, the Qing emperor had reflected on himself and presumably had no interest in driving his sons crazy. However, the revelation of Chen Pingping's rebellion made this seemingly wonderful relationship no longer so wonderful in the emperor's eyes. Yi Guipin knew this very well. If the emperor no longer completely trusted Fan Xian, then he had to be wary of whether his sons would band together and do something. Even if these 3 sons could not band together, if the emperor actually made a move against Fan Xian and chilled everyone's hearts, what would the situation in the royal palace be like when Chengping grew up day by day? Thus, the emperor wanted a concubine and more birthing machines in the palace to help him give birth to a few more sons. Yi Guipin glanced at her son. Her brows were full of worry as she gently sighed. Li Chengping did not sigh. He only gently held his mother's hand. There were many sinister things in the palace. Ever since he was young, he had grown up like this. He had watched helplessly as his 2 brothers wanted to kill him and his father for that chair. In the end, he had been saved by his other 2 brothers. He had long discovered that if the royal palace was more peaceful, life would be much smoother. However, there had never been such a good thing in the world. He knew that his connection to the Fan Manor was too deep. If his father no longer trusted Fan Xian, he would probably not be at ease leaving the world to him so easily. Pick a beauty to enter the palace? Did his father want to have a few more sons? Was he wary of him? Or was he wary of Fan Xian? Tomorrow, So will enter the palace to pay his respects. Perhaps things will not be so bad. Li Chengping forced a smile and comforted his mother. Fan Xian is very stubborn. Who knows whether or not he will enter the palace tomorrow? Yigui Pin smiled helplessly. She knew that even if the emperor wanted to have a few more sons to warn Shufeng Palace and Fan Xian, that was a matter for a long time. Furthermore, the Qing court had long gotten used to Li Chengping being the future Qing emperor. His position was even more stable than the crown prince's. The emperor would not stop the future he had planned for a long time just because of his distrust of the Fan manor. However, she truly did not know where the true problem between the emperor and Fan Xian lay. Was it Director Chen's death or something else? If Fan Xian was willing to admit his guilt and lower his head, as long as he could continue to live in Jingdo, his power and position would slowly recover. Then, Shufeng Palace would not need to worry about these beauties that had been sent to the palace by officials and nobles. The tips of Yigui Pin's brows furrowed slightly. A rare iciness suddenly flashed through her eyes. It's good if these girls know their place. If they truly want to use the little power their paternal family has in court to stir up trouble in the palace, I will not tolerate them. After all, she was a woman who had been the nominal mistress of the palace for 3 years. No matter how innocent and unaffected she was when she presided over the consort selection, most of it had long been worn away in the palace. At this moment, her cold words naturally revealed a bit of dignity. I heard that when the beauties entered the palace yesterday, Mother chased 3 of them out, Li Chengping said sincerely. After all, this is Father's wish. If you do it too obviously, I'm afraid Father will not be happy. Even if your father knew, he would still be happy. Those girls without any discernment. Yigui Pin smiled coldly. The court hasn't had concubines in a long time. From Taichung Temple to the Board of Rites, there are no rules at all. All kinds of girls are sent into the palace. I don't know what they heard in their paternal family, but once they entered the palace, they threw out large amounts of silver. Those serving maids and nannies probably haven't eaten this kind of silver in a long time, and they actually accepted it. She gazed at the third prince and calmly said, as soon as those beauties entered the palace, they asked about the situation in the palace. They didn't discuss much about the masters of the palace, but when it came to the person in the royal study, they dared to say anything. In the end, it wasn't some proper official. They were all old officials of the nobility that were about to fall. They probably didn't know what the Fan and Lu families were, and naively thought that the Fan manor had truly lost power. But for some reason, that person received the emperor's favor, so they turned their words toward that person. Who knows how unpleasant their words were? I chased those 3 beauties out of the palace to give the rest a warning and to protect their families' lives. Yigui Pin gently tucked a strand of hair at the side of her temple and faintly said, putting aside how angry the emperor would be if he actually heard this kind of discussion, if these words reached Fan Xian's ears, once things settle, how miserable do you think these beauties will be in the manor? Li Chengping finally couldn't resist laughing and said, if the recent situation really calms down, I'm afraid Mother will have to add oil and vinegar to her story for you to hear. Yigui Pin beamed with joy and spat. This child is speaking nonsense. Mother is not that kind of person. Li Chengping scratched his head and said, but Father always leaves the young lady of the Fan family in the royal study. It is not in line with the rules. Yigui Pin was silent for a long time and then smiled. She didn't say anything. In reality, she knew that the man who had turned her into a woman, the most powerful man in the world, could actually only feel lonely. In his eyes, the women in the palace all seemed to have demands. Perhaps only the young lady of the Fan family, who had nothing to do with the royal palace, could make him truly feel that he had nothing to ask for. What the emperor liked was for the people beside him to not ask for anything from him. Thinking of this, Yigui Pin's expression became dull. She gazed at Li Chengping and warmly said, you shouldn't go to the cold palace too often. Be careful that the emperor is not happy. Lady Shu has been banished to the cold palace, but in the end, she is second brother's birth mother. In the past, she has treated us brothers well. It has nothing to do with what second brother has done, Li Chengping explained in a low voice. Now that Aunt Ning has also been banished to the cold palace, I have to go see. Yigui Pin smiled and didn't say anything more. She knew that the reason the third prince often went to the cold palace to visit and gained a reputation in the palace for being benevolent as well as the emperor's unexpected admiration, was all because of Fan Xian's orders. During the Jingdo rebellion 3 years ago, it was said that Fan Xian had personally promised the dying second prince to take care of Lady Xu for him. In Shufang Palace, the mother and son quietly talked about the concubines and the girl in the royal study. At the same time, the girl in the royal study had already helped the emperor, who had yet to recover, walk one round and was about to return to the royal study. Just as Yi Guipin had said, the emperor only admired this girl and would not absurdly have any other thoughts. He had already entered the realm of a great grandmaster, and had long seen through the matters between men and women. The reason for the concubines was mostly due to political considerations. On the stroll, the emperor would not talk to Fan Ruoruo about the concubines. He only casually discussed the storm in Jingdo these 8 days and Fan Xian's matter. Most of the time, it was the emperor talking and Fan Ruoruo listening. The emperor had been raised by the Fan family's grandmother, so he had a natural closeness to the Fan family. The emperor had never had a daughter in this life. After Lin Wan moved out of the royal palace, it seemed that he could no longer find this relatively warm feeling. The two of them walked in front while eunuch Yao and a group of people followed nervously from a distance. Strolling in the dark night, this group inevitably looked a bit laughable. Just as they were about to turn into the stone door in front of the royal study, the emperor stopped his steps and looked at the bowed eunuch beside the stone door. After a long silence he asked, "How have you been with eunuch Dai recently?" This eunuch was once a popular person in the royal study, Hong Zhu. After the matter from 3 years ago had faded, he had been following eunuch Dai on paper-related errands. Coincidentally encountering the emperor in the night, he had waited to the side with complicated emotions. Unexpectedly, the emperor would suddenly greet him. He quickly replied in a trembling voice. The emperor glanced at him with satisfaction. Back then, he had greatly liked this quick-witted little eunuch. Otherwise, he would not have allowed him to personally follow in the royal study. Later, he had sent him to the Eastern Palace to be the head eunuch. It was only because of some coincidental matters that Hong Zhu had fallen into. Even so, the emperor still did not kill him. Suddenly, the emperor's heart jumped. He thought of when he saw the wheelchair earlier and the scene of Fan Xian entering the palace on that snowy day. The little eunuch pushing the wheelchair had been Hong Zhu. Gradually, a glimmer of a smile flashed through the emperor's eyes. He remembered that Fan Xian seemed to dislike this little eunuch a lot in the past. No one knew what he was thinking. He opened his mouth and ordered, "From tomorrow onwards, return to the royal study." Hong Zhu was overjoyed. He knelt on the ground and vaguely gave his thanks and kowtowed. No one noticed a complicated expression flash through his lowered eyes. The emperor waved his hand in annoyance and followed Fan Ruoruo through the stone door. The emperor suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Snow and rain, there is no need to kneel when seeing me. This is a rule I set after I ascended the throne. It has rained today, but the ground is still wet, so Hong Zhu does not need to kneel." Fan Ruoruo glanced at the emperor in surprise. She didn't know why the emperor was saying this. Am I really not a good emperor? Just as they were about to walk out of the royal study, the emperor suddenly stopped his steps and asked calmly and seriously. If there was a question, there would be an answer. At this moment, there was only Fan Ruoruo by his side, so he was waiting for her to make a judgment. Fan Ruoruo's heart trembled slightly. She thought to herself that she was not a great scholar of state affairs or a scholar with a brush of history. How could she have the right to judge such an important question? However, the emperor did not take a step. He only calmly waited for her to speak. Fan Ruoruo was silent for a long time. She thought of everything she had seen in the royal study these days, as well as the various details in the royal palace. She thought of the lives of the Qing people in the provinces she had seen as she traveled the world. In the end, she could not hide her eyes and sincerity. After thinking for a moment, she gently opened her lips and replied seriously, "Compared to the previous emperor, the emperor is indeed a good emperor." The emperor was silent for a moment and carefully savored Fan Ruoruo's words. A moment later, his expression relaxed and he laughed loudly. His laughter echoed in the garden in front of the royal study, under the eaves, and then collided with the palace wall before crashing back. Eunuch Yao and the others following behind him were slightly startled. They didn't know what the young lady of the Fan family had said to make the emperor laugh so happily. It was a happiness he had never felt before. For a moment, all sorts of feelings were mixed. They admired this young lady of the Fan family, who rarely spoke. Fan Ruoruo also smiled slightly. Looking at the emperor beside her, complicated emotions rose in her heart. She finally understood why the emperor had treated her so differently these days. Perhaps Yi Guipin had guessed some of it, and Fan Ruoruo had also guessed some of it earlier. Fan Xian's thoughts were not wrong. However, the emperor had kept Fan Ruoruo in the royal palace, by his side, in the royal study, and had her watch him manage the power of the country despite being heavily injured. Perhaps it was just that after his conversation with Chen Pingping in the royal study, the emperor needed someone to prove that he was a good emperor. No matter what that old dog in the wheelchair said, he was still a good emperor, was he not? The emperor seemed to have finally made up his mind. A confident and calm smile rose to his face again as he walked toward the royal study. Summon! Summon! Summon the Imperial College teacher Fan Xian into the palace. Some were rough and some were as sharp as a duck, but the loud calls were all the same. There were no court meetings, and it was a regular day off. The royal palace was silent. The imperial army generals and soldiers' expressions were solemn. They did not look sideways and allowed the young man in green robes to walk past them. However, what did not match their calm expressions was their nervousness. 9 days had passed since Chen Pingping's treason was exposed and he was killed by 1,000 cuts on the execution field in front of the palace. That day, Sir Fan Jr. had killed his way into the execution field and looked down on the emperor's authority. This had already made clear Sir Fan Jr.'s attitude on this matter. In the following days, the Cold War between the emperor and the powerful officials of the Qing court had developed to its peak. Countless spies the internal court had scattered outside the Fan Manor died tragically. According to rumors in officialdom, there had been an assassination attempt on Fan Xian 3 Li outside. When the news of the emperor summoning Fan Xian into the palace to pay his respects was revealed, everyone let out a breath. Although the Qing kingdom was powerful, they still did not want to bear the burden of the bloodshed that could come from the fallout of this ruler and official, father and son. From another perspective, this meant that even though Fan Xian no longer had an official position, the Qing people in the court and marketplace still thought that if he truly threw caution to the wind, he would cause a certain degree of harm to the Qing kingdom. In just 9 days, the Cold War between the emperor and Fan Xian had come to an end. It was truly something worth celebrating. In the eyes of Hu the scholar and the others, there was no problem that could not be resolved between this pair of ruler and official, father and son. It was nothing more than intense emotions that forced out the ruthlessness and stubbornness in the father and son's hearts. No one was willing to give in first. Now, the emperor had taken the first step. It meant that the palace had taken a step back. Presumably, Fan Xian had to accept this favor. In the cold air, Fan Xian silently followed Eunuch Yao forward. Eunuch Yao, who was already the head eunuch in the palace, still played the humble role in front of him. However, Fan Xian did not have much interest in talking. A teacher of the Imperial College? Although Fan Xian was now a commoner and the only thing that could be called a public official was this title, it was still piercing to the ears. Amidst these urging, Fan Xian arrived at the royal study. With some surprise, he saw Hong Zhu waiting outside the study. Fan Xian did not hide his surprise and nodded slightly. Hong Zhu bowed deeply. No one could see the exchange in the eyes between the two of them. Entering the study and seeing his sister, Fan Xian's mood calmed slightly. He then bowed deeply toward the man on the soft couch but stubbornly did not say a word. That day, Fan Xian had ridden back to Jingdo alone. Until he carried Chen Pingping's body and left the execution field, he had been reluctant to cast a glance at the man on the palace walls. Thinking carefully, it had been many months since he and the emperor had seen each other. The emperor looked at Fan Xian calmly. He was not surprised by the emotions Fan Xian revealed. He did not allow his officials to have any rebellious emotions in front of him. This did not mean he could not accept his favorite son revealing his true nature or stubbornness in front of him. The silence in the royal study did not last for long. Fan Ruoruo bowed slightly toward the emperor and smiled at her brother before leaving the royal study. She had stayed because the emperor wanted Fan Xian to be at ease. Since this goal had been achieved, she also had to leave this ruler and official a quiet environment to talk. I have long wondered why I have been so lenient toward you, the emperor looked at Fan Xian and slowly said. Naturally, it is not because of the contributions you once made to the Qing court. It was not until yesterday that I finally understood. The emperor looked at him and calmly said, I think there is no need for too much nonsense between us. There are some files here that you can take a look. In this story, it had been repeated countless times. The Qing Emperor and Fan Xian were the two most talented actors in the world. However, in the royal study, the Qing Emperor did not act. He only said these words straightforwardly. The words were very simple, but Fan Xian understood the meaning hidden within. He knew that what was placed on the file in front of him was evidence that Chen Pingping had once presided over his murder, such as the Hanging Temple, the Valley, and everything related to the separation. According to the dead old man's plan, Fan Xian should act shocked and sorrowful and then return to the emperor's side. For some reason, seeing the emperor's confident, calm and elegant expression, he felt a boundless anger. The anger made his heart ache and ache. He did not want to continue acting. Fan Xian raised his head and looked straight at the man he was most familiar with and most unfamiliar to him. He did not move for a long time. Chapter 7:17. He took a deep breath. It was not yet late autumn, but in the imperial study, a dark-colored heater had already begun to emit warmth. The air was a little dry, and it went straight from his mouth and nose to his lungs, causing him to feel a faint pain. Fan Xian looked at the emperor's face in front of him and suddenly thought of many things and people. The storm in the Qing kingdom began decades ago. As the dust gradually settled, the only ones still in the eye of the storm were probably this father and son pair. Fan Xian's attitude toward the emperor was actually very difficult to grasp. Even he could not clearly explain it. From Danzhou to Jingdo, brushing shoulders in the Qing temple, meeting for the first time in the bamboo tea shop beside Taiping courtyard, from bestowing marriage to the Overwatch Council, and learning of the portrait in the palace, Fan Xian had guessed earlier than anyone else. He had guessed his true past. Whether it was the Fan Shen of his previous life or the Fan Xian of this one, they were both fatherless and motherless. Unfortunately, they were born in the kingdom of Qing, so they had a mother named Yi Qing Mei. Later they discovered that they had a father. But this was a bloodline inheritance. For Fan Xian to truly regard this emperor as his father was something he could not have done at the time. At that time, Fan Xian had been acting the entire time. He had acted beautifully. No one knew that there was a completely different soul inside him, so he could fool everyone, even the emperor in front of him. As time slowly progressed, Fan Xian gradually began to have suspicions about the murder case in Taiping courtyard. He became a bit more wary and even afraid of the emperor on the dragon chair. Thus, his acting became more steady and cautious. But, after all these years, if Yi Qing Mei and Fan Xian were that connected soul hidden in history, an existence with a natural sense of closeness, a person who used the aura of everything around her to remind herself and gradually became one with her mother's image. The emperor had used so many years of interaction, favor, trust, methods, and realm to get closer to Fan Xian's life step by step, making him feel indecisive. It had to be said that the emperor had invested in Fan Xian a trust and tolerance that he had rarely shown in his life. At the beginning of the battle for the throne, perhaps the emperor had only watched his illegitimate son gradually grow stronger and, to a greater extent, used him. Gradually, the emperor's attitude toward Fan Xian changed, particularly after the Jingdo rebellion in the 7th year of the Qing calendar. For Fan Xian to be able to have his present position and power in the Qing court and people, it had to be said that the emperor's favor toward him had far surpassed what he had toward the crown prince or the second prince. This pair of ruler and official father and son often discussed matters in the palace and chatted in the royal study. Fan Xian hid something, so he continued to act. While acting, he could clearly feel what exactly the emperor's attitude toward him was. Thus, during these 3 years after learning the truth about Taiping courtyard, Fan Xian had been suffering with difficulty. Although he had been preparing in certain areas, he had never been able to truly settle his heart. On one hand, he knew that His Majesty was like the great snowy mountain in his dreams. It was impossible for him to be easily overturned. On the other hand, he often asked himself late at night, what kind of light would come out of the crevice he was in? How should he choose? He wanted to choose a third path that did not necessarily lead to bloodshed. Thus, he had worked hard to be the vanguard of the king and the Qing court. He worked busily, completely against his nature. He only hoped that any matter could have a relatively calm and bright ending. He wanted Chen Pingping and his father to be able to retire peacefully. In the end, all of this was an illusion. Fan Xian was disappointed, even hopeless. He felt sad and tired. He didn't want to act anymore. After carefully reading the files on the table, Fan Xian gently coughed. Thinking about it, that deep breath earlier and forcefully suppressing the emotions in his heart had already caused some pain in his unhealed lungs to once again reappear in some part of them. The emperor looked at him silently and also gently coughed. There was an acknowledgement of each other's strength between this strange pair of father and son, as well as complicated emotions. Even their injuries were put together to tell the two of them that they were actually very similar people. According to Chen Pingping's plan, perhaps at this moment, Fan Xian should show an expression of disbelief, tremble all over, be angry and confused, and then roar at the emperor, "I don't believe it. I don't believe this was done by the old director. Why would he do this?" Then, the emperor would gently and coldly explain to him what kind of goal Chen Pingping had lived for the last few decades of his life, what kind of bone-deep hatred he had for the Li royal family, and how good this old dog had been to you in the past was actually all fake. He wanted the Qing kingdom to be destroyed in turmoil and destroyed in the disaster caused by our falling out as father and son. Then, Fan Xian would still appear to be in disbelief. He would even angrily berate the emperor. "You faked all of this. Chen Pingping is not like that." Then, he would angrily leave the royal study and return to his manor. He would think for many days and truly understand the emperor's painstaking efforts, Chen Pingping's insidiousness, and so on and so forth. This was a proper court drama. This was the great turning point that the dramatists needed. The emotional conflict in the end yielded to the mutual trust between the emperor and his officials because of the ironclad truth. From then on, father and son would let go of their former enmity. The curtains would open, and the musical instruments would ring out. The glorious Qing kingdom would step onto the stage of history. However, Fan Xian did not have any expression. Fan Xian didn't have any expression. He just placed the files back on the table. He lowered his head slightly and didn't say a word. It was as if he was thinking about something important. It was also as if he was just too tired. Tired to the point that entering the palace had used up all of his energy. The emperor looked at him calmly. His eyes gradually narrowed at a very slow speed. His eyes gradually brightened and then dimmed. Disappointment rose and then turned to a kind of calm or coldness. "So, you knew all of this the entire time?" The emperor looked at his favorite illegitimate child and coldly said, "I have always found it strange. The shadow has always followed you. This kind of thing shouldn't have been hidden from you. You should have long known that the hanging temple incident was done by that old dog. I have also been thinking. If you truly continue acting according to the things presented in these files, once I ask why Chen Pingping betrayed me, I really don't know how to open my mouth." The tip of Fan Xian's finger trembled slightly. He acutely sensed that a great change had occurred in the emperor's state of mind. However, his expression did not change at all. He raised his head and looked directly at the emperor. In a slightly raspy voice he said, "I actually always knew." The emperor narrowed his eyes and looked at him. A cold light flashed and disappeared in his eyes. Fan Xian pressed his slightly dry lips together and did his best to suppress the rising and falling emotions in his heart. Calmly he said, "Furthermore, I have always worked hard. I have worked hard to not let the blood of the past swallow up the things that already exist. From the moment I made this decision, I knew it was a very naive and childish choice. However, after my battle to the death with Xueqi 3 years ago, I understood that in one's life, one has to work hard to do something. Even if others laugh at my naivety, I have to silently try. Of course, naive things are always easy to fail. However," he looked at the emperor and said, "any great thing, at the very beginning, doesn't it always seem particularly idealistic and naive to the point of ridicule? For example, the vow you, mother, and the others made by the seaside in Danzhou?" The emperor continued to look at him silently. His eyes grew brighter and brighter. From the moment Fan Xian opened his mouth to say that he knew and worked hard, he knew clearly what kind of goal his favorite son had wanted to achieve all these years. For some reason, the emperor, who was already used to coldness, suddenly felt a glimmer of warmth in his heart. Perhaps it was not a bad thing. However, this glimmer of warmth often disappeared too quickly. He has already left. He no longer thinks about the past. "Why did you?" Fan Xian looked at the emperor woodenly and said in a raspy voice, "Why did you have to have him die?" These words were directed at Chen Pingping. Fan Xian did not cry out or angrily berate. He was only filled with sorrow and helplessness, as well as undisguised hatred. He looked woodenly into the emperor's eyes. The emperor also looked at him calmly. After a long silence, the emperor smiled. His smile was cold, disappointed, and sharp. "Haha." The emperor narrowed his eyes and said, "I killed him." The emperor slammed his palm down on the table beside him. He didn't smash the wooden table into pieces, but the force was enough to send the paper on the table flying. He looked at Fan Xian and scolded in a low voice with slight anger. "What I am most angry about is this. I gave him a way out. If he hadn't come back from Dazhou, perhaps I would have pretended nothing had happened. However, in the end he came back alone. He forced me to kill him." The emperor's gaze was as cold as a snowy mountain. "I could only do as he wished. I have stood in this world for dozens of years, and I have never trusted anyone easily, but I once trusted him. I even thought that maybe I could see him as a friend, and I even gave him a chance in the end, but he didn't give me any chance." The emperor took a deep breath. His calm voice was filled with a heart-shaking coldness. "In the end, a servant will always be a servant." Hearing the word servant in these words, as well as the hatred and disdain that could not be hidden, the image of the old cripple in the black wheelchair seemed to suddenly appear in front of Fan Xian's eyes. He stared at the emperor. His voice was as sharp and cold as a knife. Gritting his teeth, he said, "The mistakes of the world are all the fault of others. Of course, Your Majesty is wise and powerful. However, I still don't know how my pitiful mother died." The emperor's face was cold. He had no reaction at all to Fan Xian's heart-wrenching words. He only narrowed his eyes and looked at him disdainfully. Including that old dog, all of the enemies of the Qing kingdom probably hoped for the scene in the royal study to happen today. "You didn't disappoint them. You only disappointed me. Someone as stupid as you cannot be taught." Fan Xian closed his eyes and then opened them. They had already recovered their calm. "However, there are many things that I still don't understand. If you don't understand something, then don't think about it." The emperor's tone was indifferent. It was clear that he was disappointed in Fan Xian's behavior. As for his last question about the cause of Yi Qingmei's death, it was unconsciously suppressed by the emperor in the depths of his sea of consciousness, not allowing it to surface. He looked at Fan Xian and coldly said, "In front of me, in the end, you are still an official. If you think too much, I will not let you continue to think." This was not a threat. It was just a simple statement of fact. It was just like the eldest princess's evaluation of Fan Xian. Fan Xian appeared to be naturally cold and unfeeling. In reality, he was very emotional and had too many weaknesses to grab. However, during the Jingdou rebellion, the eldest princess's wish had already been fulfilled. She did not deign to grab Fan Xian's weaknesses. However, in Jingdou, it was not a difficult matter for the emperor to crush Fan Xian to death. Hearing these cold and harsh words, Fan Xian straightened his body. Using a direct attitude that he had never shown in front of the emperor, he said, "Your Majesty has treated me very well these years." "I know very well." Inside the royal study, the father and son were not acting. They were both saying what they wanted to say the most. For the first time, Fan Xian stood up firmly and slowly spoke of his interactions with the emperor these years, one by one. When he got to the point where he spoke seriously, the heater in the royal study seemed to sigh. The smoke twisted as if it couldn't bear to see the father and son break apart. Only Fan Xian knew how well the Qing emperor had treated Fan Xian. If it had been the crown prince, the second prince, or any other son of the Li family standing in front of the Qing emperor and saying these words, they would probably have died a long time ago. However, Fan Xian was still alive. Perhaps the Qing emperor was a heartless person and did not treat Fan Xian with much affection. Relatively speaking, he gave Fan Xian the most affection. Listening to Fan Xian's calm recollection, the emperor gradually straightened his body. He then waved his hand tiredly and said, "I am not killing you not because I can't bear to kill you." The emperor closed his eyes and was silent for a moment. He then said, "I don't want to explain what happened in the past in front of a junior like you. But I think that perhaps those people have always been watching me from above. You are my and your mother's son. Perhaps you are like a pair of eyes they have left in this world. I won't kill you because I want to prove to you, as well as those who care about you, that I am right." He opened his eyes and coldly said, "And they are all wrong." Fan Xian bowed deeply and replied, I will stay in Jingdo obediently and watch your majesty's great plans. He did not thank the emperor for not killing him because there was no need for thanks. Since the emperor allowed him to live, he would live on well. He would keep his eyes open and watch on behalf of Yi Qingmei, Chen Pingping, and many people in the past. You will be obedient? The emperor looked at his son and suddenly laughed. His laughter suddenly stopped. Icily he said, I don't believe it, and you won't believe it. However, I have never thought that your dishonesty is a flaw. I just hope that you won't be so dishonest that I can't be bothered to tolerate it. Just stay in Jingdo. The emperor glanced at him and suddenly said tiredly, just teaching in the Imperial College is good. Don't touch the matters of the Overwatch Council and the palace treasury anymore. I don't want to spend too much time on you. Having spoken to this point, it could not be said any more clearly. The emperor was giving Fan Xian one last chance to live if he was willing to be obedient. Even though this was a threat to his life, for some reason, a glimmer of confusion grew in Fan Xian's heart. He had not thought that the emperor would make such a decision in the end. The emperor looked at Fan Xian's complicated gaze. Suddenly, his heart darkened. He thought of how Fan Xian had blurted out, "Father," by the seaside in Danzhou. After a moment of silence he said, in the future, if you have nothing to do, you can still come into the palace to pay your respects. When you are alone, I allow you to call me father. There was no one else in the royal study. It was completely silent. Fan Xian's body froze slightly. Seriously, he replied, yes, your majesty. No one knew what the emperor and Fan Xian talked about in the royal study. At least, when Fan Xian walked out of the royal study, his body was unharmed and had not become a spirit. This reality made most people in the royal palace let out a breath. The emperor had also issued an edict for Fan Xian to return to his position. There weren't even any obscure hints of rewards. On the contrary, at almost the same time Fan Xian walked out of the royal study, a few edicts that had been prepared beforehand were sent out. The court, with the cooperation of the 6 ministries and 3 temples, began to strengthen the purge of the Overwatch Council and palace treasury. The edict summoning Suzhou Zhizhou Chengjialin, Jiaozhou Judge Ho Jichang, and the palace treasury transport company Su Wenmao to the capital to report on their work had also been sent out. At the same time, the edict naming Yan Bingyun the director of the Overwatch Council left the palace one step ahead of the others. It was clear that the internal court had long made preparations. The emperor saw through his son, Fan Xian, too well. Even if he didn't want to kill him, he had enough ways to trap Fan Xian in Jingdo so he wouldn't move rashly and be too dishonest. As for whether or not the information Fan Xian had sent out through the Qinian unit could, in the end, become a bargaining chip with the emperor, it would depend on whether or not the emperor had this kind of sensitivity and powerful motivation beforehand. In reality, regarding these 2 points, there was probably no one in this world who was stronger than the emperor. Fan Xian walked out of the palace with a heavy face. Hong Zhu, who saw him out, was careful and followed at his side with slight fear. Chapter 7:18. The Fan Manor's carriage traveled on the road out of the city. It had just passed the West City Gate and was headed toward the country estate in the distance shrouded in twilight. He entered the palace in the morning, and only returned to the manor in the afternoon. Fan Xian did not tarry. He boarded the carriage with Wan Er and went to the country estate on the outskirts. Last night, an edict from the palace had come out. The surveillance of the Fan Manor had completely ended. People had thought that the Cold War between the emperor and Fan Xian had ended. Unexpectedly, after Fan Xian entered the palace to see the emperor, there was no news of his return from the palace. There wasn't even a related edict. Putting aside what the officials in court and the various powers were guessing, the fact that the Fan Manor's carriage had left just like that still shocked many people. What surprised many people was that the Fan Manor's carriage had smoothly passed through the Jingdo City Guard's inspection. More accurately, it had not been inspected at all. Was the emperor not worried that Sir Fan Jr. would leave Jingdo in a fit of anger? Although the emperor's household did not have children running away in anger, the scene on the execution field, as well as the disputes these days, made people scratch their heads in confusion about Fan Xian's response. Many people were worried whether or not Fan Xian would leave Jingdo. It was clear that the emperor was not worried. Otherwise, he would not have removed all the surveillance outside the Fan Manor or given Fan Xian such freedom. My sister is in the palace, and the emperor's edict has been sent out. The subordinates and relatives who rely on me to live are all in Jingdo. How can I leave? Fan Xian tilted his head and looked at the autumn scene illuminated by the red twilight outside Jingdo. In a quiet voice he said, "Bring back Xiaohua and Liangzi. Let's live well in the manor." Lin Wanner's heart trembled slightly. She didn't know if Fan Xian's words came from the bottom of his heart or if they contained some other meaning. If staying in the Fan Manor and being an idle person was the emperor's edict, then Lin Wan knew why Fan Xian was forced to accept this edict. The Fan Manor had received a bad piece of news when it opened. That day, Lin Wan had immediately made a decision to have Teng Zijing send the young mistress and young master to the Fan Manor outside the city. She was worried that something would happen later and was prepared to quietly send the children back to Danzhou. However, the manor had just sent news that the carriages sending the children had arrived at the manor and could no longer leave. It was not that there was an army waiting there. Rather, a eunuch was already waiting. Under these circumstances, Teng Zijing did not dare to act rashly. If he truly secretly sent the young master and mistress back to Danzhou, who knew if something would happen on the way? Would the court shed all pretenses of cordiality and snatch these two children into the palace? Fan would be the same with Fan Ruoruo. Fan Xian's brows furrowed slightly. In the end, I still underestimated the meticulousness of the emperor's thoughts. Now that I think about it, the day you decided to send the children back to Danzhou, something had just happened in the royal study. Chen Pingping had just been sent to the Overwatch Council. At that time, the emperor was heavily injured, but he still did not forget about our children. My arrangements were not thorough. At the time, we shouldn't have waited in the manor. We should have thought of a way to send them directly to Danzhou. A glimmer of darkness flashed through Lin Wanner's brows. She had not thought that her uncle the emperor would be so cold and severe that he wouldn't even let go of two children. At that time, you could only contact the first bureau. My people were scattered outside Jingdo. If you wanted to send them to Danzhou, there was no way. Fan Xian gently put his arm around her thin shoulders and comforted her. You've been tired enough these days and worried enough. This has nothing to do with you. Our emperor even dares to use the temple, much less two children. Fan Xian gently put his arm around her thin shoulders and comforted. You've been tired enough these days and worried enough. This has nothing to do with you. Our emperor even dares to use the temple, much less two children. What exactly did you and Chengping talk about in the palace? What exactly did you and Chengping talk about in the palace? Lin Wanner sighed and thought to herself. The entire family was trapped in Jingdo. The emperor did not reveal much of his extraordinary face. Only this faint threat was enough to make Fan Xian and her not dare to act rashly. Thus, she changed the topic and continued to ask the previous question. She also knew about the matter of the concubines. As intelligent as she was, she guessed the emperor's intentions. Thus, she wanted to hear some of Shufang Palace's reaction from Fan Xian. What can I say? Fan Xian smiled faintly. Hong Zhu, that little eunuch, has been by my side the entire time. He has the emperor's edict to send me out of the palace. Can Chengping and I kick him aside? There was an ambush in these words. For the sake of Hong Zhu's safety, Fan Xian had kept this secret tightly. Even the third prince did not know the true relationship between him and Hong Zhu. Earlier in Shufang Palace, the third prince had been somewhat rude to Hong Zhu. However, there is no need to worry too much. After all, Chengping has performed very well these years. How could the emperor bear to have the court fall into chaos again because of my relationship? Fan Xian's brows twitched. In front of Hong Zhu, I gave the third prince a good scolding. In any case, it will probably be very difficult for me to enter the palace in the future. I should quickly scold him. It would be best if I can make Chengping truly angry at me. The carriage moved gently along the road. In the distance, the setting sun in the western sky dragged out a long red tail. It brushed across the nearby hills and then the faintly discernible head of Tsong Mountain in the distance. Who can this fool? Lin Wanner leaned into his embrace. She felt her heart was unusually heavy. Putting on a show for Hong Zhu to see. Will the emperor believe it? Regardless of whether the emperor believes it or not, I will not see Chengping in the future. We will also have to cut off contact in Duke's Alley. It would be best if you don't enter the palace as often. Fan Xian gently stroked her face. After a moment of silence he said, "It's best if we don't drag other people into our own matters." Lin Warner straightened her body and looked at him calmly. "What do you want the Emperor to believe? To believe that Chengping does not have true affection for you? Don't forget that Big Brother is still in Dongyi. Each day he doesn't bring you and your brothers into the palace, the Emperor will not be at ease. Isn't the matter of the consort selection clear?" "Correct, it is separation," Fan Xian looked at his wife and said seriously. Fan Xian gazed at his wife and said seriously, "This is a true separation. Even if something happens to me, don't drag Chengping into it. Chen Pingping did this in the past. I also wanted to do this. However, I don't have much foresight, so I prepared much later." Lin Warner sighed helplessly and said, "Based on what you say, the Emperor still intends for Chengping to succeed. Then, why is there a consort selection?" "Just in case. This kind of thing is easy to understand," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "It's only a 10-month pregnancy. How could it be so easy to have a child? Those beauties are only 14 or 15 years old. If they want to be stepmothers, they will have to endure for a few more years." Speaking of this, Fan Xian sank into deep thought. He thought of the problem of the Emperor's masculinity. If one carefully calculated the Emperor's age, given his great-grandmaster realm body, the matter between men and women should not be too difficult. However, he was getting older, so his desires would probably grow thinner. Concerning the after-effects of the tyrannical martial secret, Fan Xian knew better than anyone else. Adding to the discussion he had with Sigu Jian at the end in Dongyi, Fan Xian confirmed that the Emperor's body no longer had normal meridians. Instead, it had become a completely unobstructed channel or vessel. Only this could allow the physical body to contain so much tyrannical zhenqi. Only then could one point into Xueqi's body on Dong Mountain and force a great grandmaster to death. No matter how tyrannical it was still tyrannical. It only had the name of the way of the Emperor. How could there be a true change? Fan Xian thought of this and raised his brows slightly. He had proven that the Emperor's constitution was cold on the outside and dry on the inside. His breathing disturbed his nature. He would probably need to eat a few more lungxiang pills. If he didn't have lungxiang pills to eat, then eating more celery would be good. Garlic? Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and thought about the Imperial Academy of Medicine's conclusion. He prayed to the heavens to ensure that a great grandmaster's body was no different from a mortal's body. Celery, garlic, and bean products, particularly the first one, had a powerful killing effect. Without question, only Fan Xian knew this knowledge. The Imperial Academy of Medicine did not know. Hongzhu did not understand. Even the Emperor did not know. Whether or not the tricks Fan Xian had done in secret would bear fruit in the future would depend on whether or not the heavens would help him. As long as the Emperor had no more children, then the third prince's position would be as stable as Dong Mountain. This was Fan Xian's hope. Perhaps making the Emperor have no more children sounded like a sinister plot. However, Fan Xian did not think so. The Emperor already had 3 sons. That was enough. If he had more, it would just create more trouble for the Qing kingdom's future in the fight for the throne. At least he didn't make the Li family die without descendants. Thinking of this, Fan Xian thought of Chen Pingping and couldn't resist smiling. "I still have the heart to offer my services, but I have no reason to see a wise ruler." Lin Warner was slightly surprised to find that Fan Xian was making another poem. Thinking about it closely, she found that this poem only talked about the grievances of an official. She looked at Fan Xian in a daze and wondered if he was truly willing to forget the death by 1,000 cuts in front of the royal palace and the bloody case in Taiping courtyard decades ago. As for the Emperor, Yi Qingmei, Chen Pingping, Fan Jian, and that group of old people, Fan Xian had already told Warner everything. Only now did Lin Warner know that in the shadows of the royal palace and behind history, there were so many heartless choices and vengeance. Thus, she did not have the extravagant hope that Fan Xian would actually stay obediently in the manor. However, she heard these 2 lines of poetry. As she thought this, the carriage arrived at the Fan clan's country estate. The entire clan, young and old, had already received the news ahead of time. They waited obediently outside the country estate for the arrival of the young master and mistress. Although Fan Xian no longer had an official position, he was still the backbone of the Fan clan. Other than the vengeance, he still had to shoulder the people his father had entrusted to him. Dusk shone on the gates of the country. Cece was carrying Fan Liang. Shunning, who was wearing a large flowery farmer's clothing, was holding on to her leg. She looked curiously at her parents who were getting off the carriage. She was already 3 years old and had no problem remembering people. Fan Xian accepted Fan Liang's embrace from Cece's hands and quietly said something by her ear. He then smiled and had the people waiting for him quickly disperse. He then pulled Shunning's small hand and walked into the central room. He asked, "Has Xiaohua been good lately?" When they reached the central room, the well-behaved Shunning let go of her father's hand and threw herself into Lin Wanner's arms. Cece was busy making arrangements for the night's rest. Fan Xian turned his eyes and saw a eunuch in the central room. He nodded toward the eunuch. The eunuch's expression was very ugly. There was also a hint of fear on his face. He quickly went forward and kowtowed to Fan Xian before leaving the country estate. The eunuch's figure disappeared through the door. Only then did Tang Zijing walk out on his crutch and spit at the figure's back. "Pay attention to hygiene," Fan Xian said with a smile. In the 4th year of the Qing calendar, Tang Zijing had been heavily injured in order to protect him. One of his legs had been broken by an assassin. Although he had gotten much better after being nursed back to health, he often used a crutch at home. Tang Zijing looked at him and said with shame, "I was useless and was unable to send the young master and young mistress away." He then continued, "I had planned to kill that little eunuch, but I was afraid it would cause trouble for you. Don't look at him just because he's a little eunuch who doesn't know anything. He represents the emperor. How could you casually kill him?" Fan Xian said carelessly. He then touched the large flowery dress Shunning was wearing and said with a smile, "It's quite bright." The wife of the Ting family came out with hot tea. She smiled embarrassedly and replied, "It's third sister-in-law's daughter's. It shouldn't have been worn by the young mistress, but..." Tang Zijing scratched his head and said, "These days there's no way to get news from the manor. The elders in the clan discussed it with my family, and thought it would not be difficult to hide it from that little eunuch. We were just worried that there might be an ambush from the court along the way. Thus, we planned to disguise the young mistress and young master as country children. If something happened, we would see if we could secretly send them away." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew what the people in the clan were preparing to do. He then thought of the bloody case in Taiping Courtyard on Lujing River. Ruoro's biological mother seemed to be like the wife of the Teng family in front of him. His face darkened and he said, "In the future, don't think about such foolish things. How can you hide it from others? Don't harm other people's children for nothing." Seeing that Tang Zijing only made a casual sound of agreement and did not take it seriously, Fan Xian sighed in his heart and scolded, "The elders in the clan can be said to be foolish. How could you all be so foolish?" Fortunately, the Fan Manor had opened and Fan Xian had rushed over. Nothing had happened, so there was no need to say these things now. However, thinking of the clan members who had welcomed him at the entrance of the country estate earlier, even someone as cold as Fan Xian couldn't help but be moved. His heart was moved, but he sank into an even deeper worry. Traveling alone under heaven, he could happily repay kindness and hatred. Even if he spilled his blood and threw away his head, it was all in exchange for no regrets. Chen Pingping still wanted to send the girls in the garden to Dongyi, but there were so many people around Fan Xian. How many could he send away? There was only one life in which to live without regrets. How could it be so easy? Their family did not stay long in the clan estate. After only one night, they picked up their children. The next day, the family of 5 left the manor to return to Jingdo. Just as the emperor had said in the royal study, and just as the eldest princess had said one day to her strategist, Fan Xian's weakness was too fatal. As long as he grasped this point, even if he grew wings, where could he escape to? Even if he could escape, would he want to? If he didn't escape, he could only face it. But, the snowy mountains were so high and so cold. Holding a pair of children, Fan Xian sat in the carriage with a smile. His gaze occasionally looked through the window at the Tsang Mountains reflecting the white light from the east in the morning. The Tsang Mountains were on the west side of Jingdo. They were far from the official road, but they were tall and majestic, piercing the clouds. It was only early autumn, so the top of the mountain had long been covered in snow, adding a touch of coolness to the world. Do you still remember those 2 years of winter in the Tsang Mountains? Fan Xian suddenly asked. After he said this, expressions of happiness and reminiscence appeared on Lin Wanner and Cece's faces. The first year, Xueqi had been purposely left behind by Fan Xian in the old manor in Jingdo. The second year, she still went with him. For the young people of the Fan Manor, the snow in the Tsong Mountains could clear their hearts and wash their faces. It was a beautiful little world completely cut off from Jingdo. There, Fan Xian could fully reveal emotions that were different from this world. Regardless of whether it was playing mahjong or chatting, the warm Kong in the winter snow always brought back such memories. The carriage gradually became quiet. Lin Wan thought of Yiling and Ro Jia, who occasionally went up the mountain. These days, the Fan Manor in Jingdo had been surrounded. Presumably, Yiling was also worried about King Jing's matter in the palace. How is King Jing? Lin Wanner asked worriedly. The emperor's anger has subsided. Naturally, he will be allowed to return to the manor. He didn't even punish me, much less him. Fan Xian shook his head. He thought of his brother, Xija. He didn't know if there would be any problems after he heard the news in the north with so many things happening in Jingdo. Sitting by Fan Xian's side, Shunning suddenly looked at the snow on the Tsong Mountains. Pursing her lips, she said in a childish voice, "So high." It was very high. It would be difficult to go up. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and gazed at the top of the Tsong Mountains. He took a deep breath. On that snowy mountain were his most beautiful memories in the Qing kingdom. There was also the time when Uncle Wu Zhu took him to climb the mountain and lie in the snow. He knew how difficult it was to climb to the peak of that snowy mountain. His eyesight was startling. Suddenly, he saw a few eagles circling toward the highest peak of the Tsong Mountains. Unconsciously, he pointed to Shunning and said, "Look, if you can actually go up, it would actually be very beautiful." Chapter 719. Under Hongzhu's lead, Fan Xian walked silently toward the outside of the royal palace. Along the way, the eunuchs and serving girls he saw all turned their bodies to greet him. Occasionally, a new person who had just entered the palace would not be able to react and would be taught a good lesson by a ranked elder. Fan Xian did not have the energy to pay attention to these things. He just walked blindly. The people in the palace looked at Hongzhu in front of him and thought that the emperor had reinstated Eunuch Hong Jr. It was probably to dirty Sa Fan Jr.'s eyes. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian did not speak harshly to Hongzhu. On the contrary, he chatted calmly with him. Hongzhu also maintained his humble appearance and appeared very harmonious. Sir Fan Jr. and Eunuch Hong Jr. were not normal people. The people watching this scene all sighed in their hearts. Perhaps only such people, who could hide their true emotions so well, could ensure their own survival and future in the unpredictable changes of the Qing court and palace. In reality, the affairs of the world were strange. In everyone's eyes, the question and answer between Fan Xian and Hongzhu on the way out of the palace was an act for everyone to see. No one thought that Fan Xian and Hongzhu were actually talking. Their voices were low, and their expressions were natural. Each of them played their roles well, but the contents of what they said were not normal. "The emperor seems to like those dishes these days." Hongzhu lowered his head and said obediently. Hongzhu lowered his head and obediently said, "The Imperial Academy of Medicine has examined them. They are all extremely good ingredients for strengthening one's constitution." Fan Xian's eyes looked straight ahead and did not look at Hongzhu's face. He gently made a sound of acknowledgement. It was impossible to see the change in his expression. 3 years ago, the rebellion had just been quelled, and the effects of the matter had gradually disappeared. Hongzhu was taken out of the cold palace. At first, he was helping out in the royal kitchen. He was a person who had once seen great things. Adding to that his own cleverness and Fan Xian's secret help, not only did his days pass by easily, but he also gradually gathered some power in his hands. Later, Hongzhu followed Eunuch Dai to work, but it did not weaken his influence on the royal kitchen. What Hongzhu said to Fan Xian at this moment was the little secret between the two of them. More accurately, it was Fan Xian's little secret. Even Hongzhu himself did not know why Sir Fan Jr. wanted to influence the food ingredients the royal kitchen sent to the emperor. Hongzhu was not worried that Fan Xian would poison the emperor. In the royal palace, this was not possible. Regardless of whether it was a chronic or acute poison, there would be specialized people to examine it. Additionally, with the food tasting segment, the possibility of poisoning had basically been eliminated. Furthermore, These ingredients that had been secretly influenced by Hongzhu to be added to the recipes also received great praise from the Imperial Academy of Medicine, particularly the celery from the south. Because of its cool nature and sweet taste, it had the effect of clearing away heat and eliminating irritability, as well as curing extreme heat and irritating thirst. It was recommended by the doctors of the Imperial Academy of Medicine to be placed on the emperor's daily dining table. Not being poisonous was the most basic requirement. Hongzhu didn't know if there were any problems with the emperor's body. However, seeing that the celery, which could cure baths, clear away heat, and eliminate irritability, was so highly valued by the Imperial Academy of Medicine, perhaps the emperor's body truly did have internal problems. Hongzhu lowered his head slightly and glanced at Fan Xian. He did not see his true emotions. He thought to himself, in the current situation, Sir Fan Jr. is still worried about the emperor's body. Is he really a loyal official and filial son? Unfortunately, Sir Fan Jr. was a sentimental person. It would probably be difficult for him to let go of Director Chen's death and obtain the emperor's happiness again. The road out of the palace from the royal study was not far. However, Fan Xian had already received an edict earlier to go to Shufang Palace to see Yi Guipin and the third prince. Thus, Hongzhu took him in the direction of the inner palace. The reason the emperor had such an edict was perhaps because, from now on, Fan Xian would truly become an idle person in Jingdo. It would be difficult for him to have another opportunity to enter the palace. Walking outside Shufang Palace, Fan Xian heard waves of young women's laughter coming from inside. His brows furrowed slightly. Why had the royal palace suddenly become so lively? He turned his head to look at Hongzhu and asked, "The madams and young ladies of the Duke's Alley are entering the palace to pay their respects today? Why are there so many people?" "They are the beauties waiting to be selected. Because they have to wait for the candidates sent up by the various provinces next month, these dozen beauties will have to stay in the palace for a bit longer. Guipin has probably summoned them today and will have to follow some rules," Hongzhu replied quietly. Fan Xian listened to this news with a startled expression. For a moment, he could not come back to his senses. These days, he had been under house arrest in the Fan Manor. Later, he had been busy with those secret plans and had not paid attention to the rumors about the consorts in Jingdo. It was not until now that he learned that the emperor was preparing to take a wife again. Just like Yi Guipin and the third prince, Fan Xian did not spend too much time before he sensed the hidden meaning behind the consorts. His brows furrowed. He knew that not only was he moving, but the emperor was also moving. Furthermore, if the emperor did not move, it would be fine. Once he moved, it would be a sword pointing at the future and giving him the strongest warning. There was a glimmer of confusion and apology in his heart. This apology was for the mother and son in Shufang Palace. In this world, there were not many people like the mother and son who truly trusted a powerful aide from outside the palace. This kind of trust was rare. Now, because of him, they were going to face an unpredictable danger. Fan Xian's heart was uneasy. Seeing Fan Xian stand silently in front of Shufang Palace, Hongzhu thought he was thinking that there were beauties inside and that it was not appropriate for him to enter to see the empress and the third prince. In a quiet voice he asked, "It is my fault. How about you come back another day?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "Why wouldn't I come in? Not following the rules? I have never been a person who abides by the rules. The emperor has given me an edict, so I came to see. If I still don't come to see, who knows when the next opportunity to enter the palace will be?" As he spoke, Fan Xian was already striding towards Shufang Palace. The two eunuchs guarding the palace door had come with the beauties. They did not know who Fan Xian was. Seeing a young man wearing a plain cotton robe charging into the palace, they couldn't help but jump in fright. Although they did not know Fan Xian, to be able to stay in the palace, they were all clever people. They did not dare to stop him. One of them followed behind Fan Xian and lowered his voice to greet him. The other charged into Shufang Palace to inform the people inside. Once he entered Shufang Palace, he heard a wave of panicked shouts and the sound of clothes being adjusted. Most of them were curious gazes. Fan Xian had come too quickly. The eunuch did not have time to say anything, and the palace girls did not have time to prepare anything before he entered the palace. Suddenly, countless pairs of eyes focused on him. The atmosphere in the kingdom of Qing was relatively civilized. Although they were deep in the palace, and men and women had to be on guard, suddenly seeing a young man enter the palace, these girls only lowered their voices and exclaimed a few times. They were not so embarrassed that they wanted to die, nor were they so perverted as to cry out loud. Amidst the forcefully suppressed panic, Fan Xian smiled warmly and bowed seriously toward Xueqi in the middle. "Auntie, it is quite lively here today." However, Fan Xian had already formally broken off relations with the emperor in the royal study. Although the emperor still had a death grip on his weakness and he couldn't do anything, in terms of his personality, he no longer wanted to hide anything. He faintly revealed a carefree spirit of not caring about anything. Xueqi was the sister of Lady Lu. When Fan Xian first entered the palace, she had been very fond of this jade-like little boy. Now that Fan Xian had long grown up, their relationship had long been very close. In private, Xueqi always wanted Fan Xian to call her aunt. She had not expected that with so many people in the palace, Fan Xian would still call her like this. Xueqi smiled slightly and said, "How old are you to be so cheeky?" These words seemed unhappy, but they were actually a reminder and a question. Fan Xian looked at her and shook his head. He smiled. A glimmer of worry appeared at the corner of Xueqi's brows. Fan Xian's behavior today was too strange. It looked like although the conversation in the royal study had not reached the worst result, it did not have any signs of getting better. Thinking of this, Xueqi's heart felt like a large stone was pressing down on it. It was heavy. She forced a smile and said, "Why did you want to enter the palace today?" Everyone in the palace knew Fan Xian's purpose for entering the palace. This was just a formality. Fan Xian explained a bit. At this time, Xinger had already moved an embroidered stool over. This former little serving girl had now become the most senior serving girl in Shufeng Palace and had the most power to speak. Fan Xian looked at her delicate face and smiled. He even found a moment to chat casually. Only then did he seriously say to Xueqi, "Other than seeing the emperor also ordered me to see the third prince's homework." The worry between Xueqi's brows grew stronger and stronger. She thought to herself, "Is he here to say goodbye?" However, the young lady of the Fan family was in the palace, and there were hundreds of people in the Fan manor and the Duke's manor. Would Fan Xian actually dare to leave? For a moment, she couldn't help but have many things she wanted to ask Fan Xian. However, the beauties present were all looking curiously at this young man, so she couldn't ask. Xueqi's heart was very irritated. She wanted to chase all of these teenage girls out of the palace. Fan Xian looked at her expression and knew that this concubine had misunderstood. He smiled and said, "Where is the prince?" This was finding an excuse to leave. After all, he was sitting in a room full of the emperor's future concubine. She was like his little stepmother. Fan Xian only wanted to use this opportunity to see the hidden meaning of the concubine selection. He didn't want to stay here forever. "Pinger is in the back. You can go by yourself." Xueqi felt a headache coming on. She looked at him and shook her head. The serving girl Xinger gazed at Fan Xian and smiled. She led him to the back. Hongzhu followed closely behind. In the eyes of the bystanders, this was the emperor ordering Hongzhu to keep an eye on him. As Fan Xian walked into the back of the hall, the atmosphere immediately relaxed. From the moment he entered, the dozen beauties forced themselves to calm down after a slight panic. They wanted to display the bearing of a royal family in front of the concubine. However, looking at the young official's handsome face and confident bearing, how could these girls, who were only 14 or 15 and usually found it difficult to even step out of the front door, completely calm down? What made them curious was how such a young man dressed like a commoner could walk freely in the tightly guarded royal palace. Listening to this person's conversation with Xueqi, any of the beauties with a bit of insight guessed that this person was Sir Fan Jr. Unable to stop it, his appearance, which had been so good that it did not seem mortal, immediately gained a bit more luster in the eyes of these beauties. Regardless of whether it was the bold or the shunning, directly or quietly, they all looked at Fan Xian a few more times. At this moment, Fan Xian had left. Finally, a brave girl from the Duke's alley asked, "Concubine, is this Sir Fan Jr.?" With Xueqi's nod of confirmation, these beauties couldn't help but begin to discuss in whispers. After all, they were still young girls. They had been bored in the palace for a few days and had suddenly met the legendary Sir Fan Jr. It was no wonder they were so excited. They had even tossed the admonitions at home before they entered the palace and the warnings of the teaching nannies in the palace to the back of their minds. However, There were a few arrogant beauties who just sat calmly to the side. They had seen something strange from Fan Xian's attire. In addition, these beauties had always seen the young lady of the Fan Manor in the royal study as their greatest enemy. Thus, when they saw Fan Xian today, they were not moved. On the contrary, they felt a faint hostility. Things have already been said to this extent, yet the emperor still wants you to go to Shufeng Palace. In a normal carriage, Lin Wan'er looked at the slightly tired Fan Xian beside her. Quietly, she said, "The matter of the consort selection has happened very suddenly. I think the emperor is just giving you a warning. He doesn't have anything against the third prince, so don't worry too much." When they were alone, Fan Xian always referred to the emperor as Old Emperor, while Lin Wan'er referred to the man who had held her growing up as Uncle Emperor. It was not considered disgraceful, but it was somewhat domestic. Today, Lin Wan'er had directly referred to him as Emperor. Fan Xian knew that his wife understood that his mood was very poor. It is also to warn the officials in court not to think that the future Qing kingdom will definitely be the third prince's. He smiled and said, "Although the emperor is old, his ambition is still there. I just don't know if his awe-inspiring spirit is still there." What did you and Chengping talk about? Lin Wan'er gently pulled back the curtain of the carriage and looked at the early autumn Jingdo Street scene outside. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.